Reiko was a tiger created in the south of the eastern forest. He wasn't all that special in the beginning. In fact, his innate ability was quite lacking compared to his brothers and sisters, which resulted in him being disregarded. Even then, it wasn't to the point where they outright ignored him or attacked him, they just didn't care about him either way. A very average tiger. He could have just lived life like that. He didn't have any lofty goals and he wasn't in any way deranged like the crying ghost. It wouldn't be a terrible life, just a very mundane one. Unfortunately, he encountered Draco of the Snake Clan. After that near-death encounter, Reiko seemed to have become a little wary about leaving his cave, even refusing to go and hunt. He lived in the outskirts of the tiger territory, so no one ever looked for him. But this situation only lasted 3 days before he was actually visited by Draco. With overbearing arrogance, he would bully the tiger day after day, finding it amusing that there was actually a predator that didn't resist a beatdown. It's what happened the first time which is what got him intrigued and why he followed the tiger here. In truth, Reiko was just really afraid of pain, so he would always just focus on defense when being attacked, but if he had the advantage he would shamelessly act like some kind of ferocious predator. Eventually 8 months passed and yet, each day he was left almost dead and unable to leave when Draco left for the day. If Draco didn't feed him essence-rich herbs and carcasses, he would have long since left this world. But at this point Reiko was absolutely livid. He hated that fiery-looking worm, he hated his resplendent scales, he hated his imposing size. Why couldn't he, Reiko, stand out like that and bully others? At the very least, when the essence nourished his body it would automatically target the injuries and in the process, granting endurance to those locations. And since there was no place that hadn't been assaulted, his entire body was fully remade tougher and tougher each day. But it was on his 251st torment day and having already suffered his 251st beating and being left to heal by the evil snake that a shocking event that would change his life and the lives of those around him forever took place. Boom! An unfamiliar energy exploded out within him, enhancing the bones, nerves, tissues, organs and flesh all over his body. His muscles were especially upgraded. His body even began to grow, jumping a whole 3 meters in height, leaving him at 5 meters tall. It didn't even feel uncomfortable. In fact, it felt so good that Reiko let out a dignified roar that actually shook up the surrounding mountains. CK. A mere magic beast roar wasn't even qualified to shake a bush, talk less of a mountain. But it did sound domineering enough, making all the beasts that heard instinctively have the urge to submit. The shocking thing was that some of them had a higher cultivation and yet they still quivered with fear. Although they could sense the vibe from the roar only being on the level of a stage 2 magic beast, the feeling they got from it wasn't inferior to those of the stage 3 magic beasts at all. This mysterious phenomenon was both inexplicable and terrifying. All they knew about the correlation between cultivation rank and strength was becoming undone and it wasn't making sense. But anyone with basic knowledge from another experienced mid-world could easily tell you that what was currently happening with Reiko was entering the first stage of anatomy refinement. Anatomy refinement was another method of cultivating strength, but this had nothing to do with harnessing magical energy, fire elements or lightning laws. Anatomy refinement was the act of using energy to directly increase the strength of one's physical body. Anatomy refinement could actually be simultaneously used with energy refinement, cultivation, but most people didn't even dare to refine their anatomy, talk less of dual cultivating with energy. It was just too dangerous and most enlightened species couldn't handle it. It was a bit easier for beasts, but even then most still withheld from it. This was because it was too dangerous. Magic herbs weren't as common as grass like they were in Eridel's world. They were very rare, so how could they continuously use them like Reiko was doing? Even more, splitting your attention between energy cultivating and anatomy cultivating was counterproductive most of the time. Only the most talented sons and daughters of prestigious families could afford to do so. But this was Eridel's world, where it was easier to find a world tree than it was to find a single regular herb, so who knows? After all, that's exactly what was happening right now to some random tiger in the wild. The process of repeatedly destroying and healing your body with essence. The crudest way of anatomy refinement, but it is what it is. This was what happened to Reiko until he entered stage 1. But it was not over yet. The benefits of increasing your physical strength wasn't the only gift anatomy refinement had to offer. In fact, it was the second gift that had many people risking their lives to attempt it, even if most gave up. Suddenly, Reiko started to feel an itchiness all over his body that made him choke on his roar, and it soon became quite unbearable. He even began rolling and thrashing around in an attempt to alleviate the discomfort that was rapidly becoming pain. His screams were quite unlike the previous majestic roar, now it was like a squealing pig that was being butchered. But soon, the culprit of this change of events revealed itself. A black and viscous liquid began to leak out of the pores all over the tiger's body like it was blood, which was a horrifying sight to see. Also, the disgusting smell of it didn't help the situation at all. It had to be one of the most rankest smells in existence. But to tell the truth, it wasn't all that unfamiliar. This is what happens to all enlightened species in the body refinement realm, but not on the level it was happening now. In fact, the stuff would only leave the body during excrement, making it especially smelly, not all over the pores like it was doing now, and it would never leave the body at the rate it was doing now, only doing so by small amounts, not even in 1,000th of the current visible, in each of the 9 body refinement breakthroughs. It was all disgusting and horrendous, but this is what all cultivators dreamed about. The removal of impurities. Each time someone had a breakthrough in the body refinement realm, they expelled impurities out of their body in the form of excretion. As a result, the body was cleansed and the resistance in essence flow was reduced, increasing your ability to wield your mana and enhancing your strength. A byproduct of this was that you also became more attractive. Clear skin, muscular physiques, for males, soft bodies, for females, and symmetrical faces. There was no such thing as an ugly cultivator. This didn't mean that beauty suddenly lacked value, it just meant that the bars were raised. But despite the concept of body refinement, even the most talented of cultivators would only get rid of 25% of his impurities before being forced into the mana refinement realm. These were the benefits of the body refinement realm, and they ended with the body refinement realm. Unless you took special treasures, you would never get further chances to remove the impurities in your body. Or at least that should be the case, but here's where anatomy refinement comes in. Anatomy refinement did the same things body refinement did on a much more stupendous scale, but just as a side effect. The point of anatomy refinement was to make the body tougher, stronger, faster. In fact, the intent of anatomy refinement was bodily perfection. Anything to do with the body was empowered each stage. Even things like coordination, dexterity, and cognitive abilities were improved. After all, improving the body meant improving the brain. Not only did this increase your talent for energy refinement by making the flow of mana in your body run 10 times faster, it increased your appearance by many-fold. The 2 big reasons that cultivators salivated at the concept of anatomy refinement. The scary thing that many people didn't know was that anatomy refinement had no limit. As long as you had the will and the resources, you could technically reach stage 1000 or more, gaining a body that would be unscathed even if you threw a condensed universe at it. But there were 2 things to note here. 1, while the term will was used lightly, just the refinement from stage 9 to stage 10 would require the will to withstand swimming in lava, and that was having it easy. Typically, all the impurities in the body would be vanquished at stage 10, so anatomy refinement stopped wasting time with cleansing the body and put its full attention on perfecting the body, increasing the effect and simultaneously the pain of anatomy refinement by multiple times. And 2, the resources required to enter something like stage 1000. Wouldn't you need to empty out an entire universe or 2? At this moment in time, Reiko didn't have to worry about things like that. The breakthrough was over and he had to first get rid of all the trash on his body. After jumping in a nearby lake and cleansing his body, he came up to a clean side of the lake and finally got a good look at himself. The orange on Reiko's fur was turning gold, with his black stripes looking more sleek and the under white looking as pure as snow. Even his facial structure and muscle ratio had changed, looking more handsome, for a tiger, and symmetrical. Reiko's change in appearance made him look majestic and imposing, giving off the impression of a divine beast king. After striking different poses and tooting his horn for a little while, he decided to flee from his location. Reiko wasn't dumb before, but now he was one of the smartest beasts in the entire world, and he knew that as long as he stayed here, the rank 4, at the time, Draco would be back tomorrow to make his life hell. He knew that to get his revenge, he had to increase his strength and challenge the evil snake at a later point, and so now that his body was healthy and he actually had the capability to leave this time, how could he possibly be so foolish as to dilly-dally? From then on, Reiko began to move smarter. He conquered the weak and escaped from the strong until he could come back and defeat them. With his power, he swiftly started an uprising in the tiger hierarchy and achieved dominance over all tigers within 2 months. At that time, he had also become a 3rd-stage magic beast with the power of a 4th-stage magic beast. But he knew it wasn't enough to even hold his ground against the snake with perfect affinity with the laws of fire, even if he didn't know the source of his strength. Despite Draco still being a 4th stage magic beast, he could easily deal with a stage 8 magic beast, so if Reiko wanted to compete, he had to reach a power level of stage 9 just to have an even fight. How did Reiko know? Well, he had once encountered the evil snake again and almost died. Using all kinds of shameless and unconventional techniques, he escaped the snake who was using his full power to chase, allowing Reiko to feel the powerful vibe. Even then, there was no way he could contest with the powerful snake clan even if he somehow obtained revenge. They would never let him go, and if that was the case, he needed his own army. The tigers weren't enough, their population was roughly 12,000, at this time, even though all of them throughout the forest had migrated to the south side while the snakes had roughly 50,000, at this time. Snakes produced 10 to 30 eggs in one go after all. If not for them antagonizing Dodo, there would be a lot more. So how could Reiko get more subordinates? Well, how about other races? It was this thought that caused ambition to flood Reiko's heart, even causing his ravening desire for revenge to slightly diminish. Why must a powerful and handsome beast like him have to be content leading one race? There was no one but him and that devilish snake, that he knew of, that was better than him, and since taking care of that sinister snake was only a matter of time, he was the only one eligible to become the king of all beasts. Deciding that he was the chosen one, Reiko began to dominate throughout the forest, subjugating other species and stealing their resources. In a world where every herb and such were already a resource, the more powerful and essence-rich herbs were considered the true resources. Natives of this world looked at low-grade herbs like they looked at grass, and truth be told, there wasn't much difference. Reiko's actions finally caught the attention of the others in the forest, but they mostly took a wait-and-see approach. But some of them had greed and ambition control their thoughts. Whilst the concept of stealing and conquering existed, it wasn't really conquering. All they did was kill the original owners of the land and take the resources there. The thought of subjugation didn't occur to their primitive minds at all. The elves were especially excited about this new concept of subjugation, even if they would never admit to the fact that a mere beast had come up with the idea first. They thought of themselves as the natural rulers of the forest, and ideas to completely rule over every inhabitant began. It couldn't be helped, every other race around them were completely lacking in comparison. All they did was eat and sleep, they didn't even have the ability to create proper homes. Even that other counterfeit race that looked like them were barely different from the other beasts. On the other hand, the elves had developed language, culture, arts and crafts, martial arts and more. As a result, this gave them a sense of superiority and entitlement to the entire forest. But just as the idea of domination was brewing and they were beginning to get excited, Titania put a stop to the idea completely, banning anyone from subjugating other races and threatening those that still harbored such thoughts with death. All the elves were perplexed, but they didn't dare to reject. They all knew that everything they obtained was a result of their queen's continuous blessings, so they didn't even feel upset. Whatever their queen said was more than law, it was the truths of the universe. So they could only watch as that upstart tiger continued to run around the south, conquering all the beasts and hoarding all sorts of treasures that he divided amongst his upper echelons, namely the tiger clan, wolf clan, bear clan, monkey clan and eagle clan. It was only after 2 years that he completed his goal. Subjugation over the entire south, with all the inhabitants there hailing him as the beast king. But of course it wasn't smooth sailing. There were numerous times that he got jumped by either the barbarians or the snake clan. Neither of them wanted to see him become a threat in future, so they repeatedly tried to kill him, only to regret it. Every time they attacked the south, that shameless tiger would always escape before sneaking into their respective territories and killing whoever he could, causing both the barbarians and the snake clan to feel both wrathful and helpless. Eventually, they all turned a blind eye to him and pretended he didn't exist. They couldn't afford for him to keep killing their younger generations, so they could only ignore him and wait for an opportune time. This allowed for Reiko to smoothly take over the rest of the south and become a 6th stage magic beast, becoming the first beast king in history. He lorded over various species and possessed boundless treasures, but it wasn't enough. That sinister snake could still easily kill him, and he couldn't obtain his revenge yet. There was something about that snake that set him different from other beasts. But even if the difference was incomparable, wasn't he the same? Thinking back on what changed his life, Reiko made a firm decision. He needed to improve his secret source of strength, it was the only way. He had been pondering over it over the years, but thinking of the pain always frightened him away from making a decision. But he had already become the Beast King and he was nowhere near strong enough to challenge a single Draco, talk less of the Snake Clan. If he wanted his revenge, he needed more power. Reiko traveled to a location he had found on one of his adventures. It was a barren mountain that towered 15 kilometers high, but one of the strange things about it was that there was no life here at all, no nature and no animals. It was completely empty of life. Even more strange was the lightning that repeatedly struck the peak with an interval of 5 to 30 minutes. A strange phenomenon that perplexed the tiger, but he didn't think too much. It was the lightning that was his goal. He intended to use it as a means to refine his body. He had already brought numerous essence-rich treasures for a long stay here because he wouldn't leave until his power upgraded. And like this, Reiko's anatomy refinement once more took place. The tiger was struck over and over again, only managing to survive because of the resources that he brought. But what didn't know was that each time he was struck by lightning, the remnant lightning essence would be absorbed into his body along with the herbs that he devoured. Time was fleeting and eventually 10 months passed. It was at this time when Reiko was contemplating giving up, thinking that his secret strength was a one-time upgrade, that there was a sudden change. A familiar burst of energy exploded out all over his body, bringing an exquisite feeling of comfort that felt even better than the last time. The previously whimpering Reiko stretched out and let out a tyrannical roar that seemed to demand that all those that didn't submit must die. As his body healed, charred black fur fell off his body with new fur that was even more golden and silkier than before replaced the old. His claws and fangs became sharper and more menacing, and even his previously green eyes changed, gaining a hint of gold and a king's dignity. The tiger grew another meter and gained denser muscles that made him look like a fledgling behemoth. The final change on the tiger was the king character on his forehead becoming more pronounced, no longer looking like accidental markings. Looking at the now twitching tiger that was undergoing the impurity cleansing part of the breakthrough, one couldn't help but anticipate his future. Boom! A ball of fire crashed into the ground near the dancing tiger, nearly charring his fur despite its resilience. At this moment in time, Reiko and Draco were fighting again. God knows how many times they had been fighting ever since Reiko's last breakthrough that made him a rank 7 magic beast with the fighting prowess of a rank 9. Although he had the ability to go head-on with Draco, he never won. He wasn't even able to gain an advantage despite the fact that his martial ability was stronger and Draco was still only rank 4. Something that caused the prideful tiger great humiliation. This result could only be explained by Draco's Law of Fire foundation. Since his mana was formed from the laws of fire, each breakthrough in the magic beast realm, body refinement realm, refined his body with the best flames available, making his body extremely powerful. And if he had the capability to actually use the essence of those fire laws to attack instead of having to convert it into regular fire elements, talk less of magic beasts, even a spirit beast would vanish from a single ball of fire whether it hit or not. But as it stands now, Draco didn't have that ability to summon forth a lick of fire laws at all. He and his future generations would die first. Henceforth, he had to dilute the laws of fire into the fire elements, but as a result of this, he had endless flames to use. One essence of fire law equals 10,000 elements of fire, so you can imagine. However, this didn't mean you could recklessly use large amounts of energy just because you had it in your core. For energy to leave your core, it had to pass through your mana circuits or whatever you had as substitution, so you had to be careful you didn't destroy them by being reckless. The fight between Reiko and Draco could be considered one of their biggest ones yet, and things were getting intense as they tussled through the forest without being aware of where they were going. Something they would come to regret. As heads butted, claws flashed and fangs snapped, the smell of the surroundings began to change, indicating that they had entered someone's territory. When someone claimed territory, the longer they lived there, the longer the territory was affected by them depending on their strength. Minor things like a minute change in smell that any beast could sense was one of them. Unfortunately, the two fighters were too busy to notice. Somewhere in the central eastern forest, northern territory. The location was dark because of the towering trees that covered the skies, but two things could faintly be seen. First was the decently sized pond that twinkled from the few rays of sunlight that made it through the canopy. The second thing was a colossal-sized silhouette that towered over 10 meters and emitted a daunting aura that would cause the hearts of anyone watching to skip a couple beats. Strangely, there were two objects that faintly resembled tree branches standing erect at the top of its head, but it didn't take away from the impact of the scene in the slightest. The colossal being suddenly twitched as if it noticed something and swung its head in a certain direction. Where a pair of eyes should be, two white menacing lights that could cause some of the most vigorous youths to suffer from heart attacks slowly appeared. Those two stinking rats actually dare. Reiko leapt to the left, narrowly dodging Draco's bite before lunging at the snake's neck and pinning him to the ground. Reiko grinned with glee. This was the first time he obtained the upper hand. As he brandished his claws in preparation to strike, flames suddenly erupted, covering the entirety of Draco's body like a protective cloak. Reiko grunted with frustration before jumping off. Death wasn't his type, so he mostly refrained from actions that suggested he was trying to court it. Burning seemed to be one of the things that got Death's attention, so he had no qualms retreating. Draco majestically raised his head akin to a proud dragon, his blazing eyes and fiery mane making him look supernaturally beautiful, the disdain in his eyes making him look like a king in front of a slave, and the roll of his tongue as he hissed making him look menacing. All of these features fused to create a heart-stopping image that would make onlookers pause with awe as a feeling of submission rose in their hearts. But Reiko didn't appreciate the view at all. He roared with dignity, easily negating the charming effect that Draco emitted. His golden fur sparkled and his claws/fangs gleamed threateningly. His looks didn't lose out to Draco's in the slightest, and as a king of beasts, the aura he had was more oppressive and charming, surpassing Draco's, who had his big sister Yorma as a role model in his heart, preventing him from having thoughts of being king. Just as they were about to clash again, Reiko finally noticed something, causing him to sniff tentatively. The hairs on Reiko's body slightly raised in mild alarm, causing Draco to realize that something was wrong. Reiko had finally realized that they were in an unknown territory and he didn't know the owner's strength, causing him to be wary. On the other hand, Draco suddenly choked on his hiss and started coughing. His eyes bulged and his pupils narrowed to pinpricks. His scales suddenly lost its luster and the flames around his body were immediately doused. Even his half-flame half-hair mane lost its magnificence, looking rough, dry and tangled as if he had become an old man. Without hesitation, he sped away at full speed, the picture of despair clearly visible on his face. Reiko wasn't dumb at all and realized that the evil snake must have recognized the owner of this territory, and the owner must have been a terrifying one for the sinister snake to have run like that. Anything that could cause that snake to look like Death had feelings for him wasn't something Reiko had any interest in meeting, so he turned and ran. Two beasts could be seen running to the boundary of the Central Eastern Forest, Northern Territory, seemingly trying to escape from something. At first glance, it looked like the snake in the front was being chased by the tiger at the back, but this notion was broken when the tiger started to overtake the snake and wasn't slowing down at all. These two haggard-looking beasts were actually running from something else. But what was it? That shameless cat, how dare he, is what could be interpreted from Draco's thoughts. His mind was completely gripped by fear, and as a result his thinking abilities were severely diminished, so when he saw that Reiko was surpassing him, unjustified rage started to occupy his thoughts. He was completely blaming his dilemma on the tiger and wanted nothing more than for Reiko to be used as bait to aid in his escape. But how could that be possible? At this moment, Reiko could feel an ominous presence in the air that was constantly looming over them, but he had zero interest in staying to find out its origin, so he left Draco in the dust without a second thought and focused all his efforts on escaping. Soon, he could finally see the boundary of this accursed territory and hope flooded his heart. At this point all distractful desires like ambition and vengeance were washed clean. He only hoped to escape without issue and live to see another day. But it seemed fate had something else in store for him. SSSHH. Just as Reiko was about to reach the edge of the territory, a loud sound of rustling leaves was heard. Reiko quickly stopped running and turned his head to the left, looking for the source of the sound. But nothing was there. Just as he was about to turn back, a sudden smell that caused his hairs to stand on end entered his nose. Reiko slowly looked back to his front. Standing just in front of the edge of the territory was an enormous beast that surpassed 10 meters tall, standing on 4 legs. The behemoth-like creature had pristine white fur that gave off a holy glow, eyes that were completely pale blue with no other color that shone like stars, hooves carved from ice that released a cold mist, and 2 antlers in the same nature but replaced the mist with swirling blue lights. It was the guardian of the eastern forest, Dodo. Reiko couldn't help being petrified by the colossal beast in front of him that was brimming with a celestial's disposition. Looking at the menacing antlers that resembled tree branches because of the elk's ridiculous size, Reiko couldn't but begin to shake violently. This was not an existence he could compete with at all. Draco shared the same sentiment, but he was not so foolish as to remain in place, shaking in fear like a certain pussycat. He turned around and fled immediately after recovering from shock. As someone who also contained a law in his body, Dodo's presence wasn't so brain-crippling to him even if the elk had 3 laws. Unlike the so-called Beast King, Draco still retained some ability to act upon his thoughts, something the tiger was unable to do no matter how much he screamed at himself to run. So Draco didn't hesitate to run, he wanted nothing more than to escape this calamitous beast and never meet it again. Just look at those antlers. They radiated a shocking amount of energy that Draco was unable to identify, but he could feel the terrifying coldness all the way here, a strange feeling that he only felt once before because of his fire laws. And the first time he ever felt cold was naturally when he met Dodo for the first time. That was a devastating experience for the Snake Clan that they would never forget. Half of them died after all. But unfortunately for Draco, even if he didn't want to experience the might of the guardian of the forest, he wasn't the one making decisions here. Dodo softly tapped his hoof. CCCCCCCCRRR. Ice began to explosively spread out from the point Dodo's hoof made contact with the ground, quickly reaching both Reiko and Draco and freezing them up to their necks, leaving their heads free. Clack, clack, clack. Dodo began to slowly walk up to the 2 beasts, causing them shiver even more than what the frigid ice was doing to them. At this point it looked like they were vibrating. Well, their bodies from the neck down were frozen completely, but their heads. One couldn't help but wonder if their heads were going to snap off. As Dodo got closer to Reiko, he manipulated the ice to bring Draco right beside his former enemy, lining them up like 2 naughty school kids in front of the teacher's desk. Their rapidly shaking heads made the scene more comical than it was. But for Reiko and Draco, this situation was more like. Neither of them could think coherently anymore, their minds on the verge of collapsing. Dodo's indomitable and world-threatening aura, the blood-freezing cold, the futility to resist, the inability to comprehend and the presumption of certain death. It was utter despair. Gradually, Reiko and Draco's eyes began to rise up with froth beginning to leak out of their mouths. Dodo stiffened, he didn't mean for things to go this far. He had only meant to scare them a little bit, but he didn't know the effect his killing intent had on people. Most of the time, he killed his enemies before they could even feel anything, talk less of despair on this level, either that or they ran away. He never held them captive like he was doing now, and the results were as shown. Dodo sighed in lament, he had only wanted to have a conversation as fellow rulers of this forest. They made his job of protecting the forest and more importantly Sierra easier after all. But he couldn't just let them go unpunished, could he? Otherwise they would take him for a joke and come to mess around in his territory again. But look at the result. Dodo sighed one more time before a sudden ice storm formed around him, quickly hiding him from view. However, it didn't last long and it soon disappeared, but when it did Dodo was nowhere to be seen. The ice that he had left in this place also shattered, leaving the 2 remaining beasts to slump down, finally free. But the damage had been done. All that could be seen of their eyes was white sclera and burst blood cells as they continuously twitched. A whole month had passed before the 2 beasts did something other than twitching with their eyes rolled up and saliva dribbling freely. KHK. Reiko was the first to snap awake and choke on the saliva and unsuspecting inhabitants that was no doubt filling his throat. He began to shiver as he briefly reminisced the never-ending nightmare that he had to undergo this entire time. Fortunately, he managed to break out when he had finally built up resistance, an unforeseen benefit that would aid him in future. Cookta. Draco suddenly spat out a glob of spit containing a few bugs onto the floor, indicating his revival, but creating a nauseating sight. But Draco was in no shape or form to care about such trivial things. He looked around wildly, like a cornered beast looking for its predator. To see such a mighty figure like Draco now act like a helpless prey was just too regrettable. If anyone from the Snake Clan was to see him now, his reputation would vanish like smoke. Fortunately, Draco soon calmed down when he saw there was no one else here apart from Reiko, who was currently getting up and preparing to leave. Hissus! Draco hissed at him to grab his attention, successfully making the tiger turn around in slight shock and more confusion. To be honest, Reiko had completely forgotten that Draco was here. He had more pressing things in mind, like the condition of his mind and body. Moreover, he had been away for an undetermined amount of time, so he needed to check in his territory as soon as possible. Does he seriously still want to fight? Reiko thought warily. He was honestly tired of fighting right now and didn't want to go head-to-head with the snake, knowing things could get out of hand. But against Reiko's expectations, Draco dipped his head, briefly flashing the suspiciously familiar antlers attached to his forehead before raising his head and looking into Reiko's eyes intently. This action was a complete shock to the tiger because the meaning of this gesture wasn't light at all. Since there were many beasts with different types of vocal abilities, there was no way to achieve conversation yet, so the two leading beasts at the time, Dodo and Yorma, came up with a set of gestures as a temporary substitute. Spirit beasts can communicate mentally. There were two common gestures that everyone used. One was to completely lay on your belly with your head touching the ground, indicating surrender or submission. The other was to slowly nod your head to the other whilst maintaining eye contact. This action meant that you considered the other an equal and that you respected them. More importantly, it meant that you were seeking friendship with the other. If the other was to reciprocate the gesture, it meant that they were accepting the offer of friendship. Reiko was completely stunned. Was this still the same evil snake that chased him all the time? At first he was angry. How dare he still seek friendship with him after all they had done? Was his desire for revenge something that could be disregarded so easily just because the other finally acknowledged him? Complex thoughts like that flipped through his brain, agitating him further and further until he almost began growling. Any other beast wouldn't be so pressured. It would be a yes, let's be friends, or no, how dare you, let's fight. Magic beasts had both a low IQ and EQ after all. But Reiko wasn't stupid in the slightest. He was someone who had entered the second stage of anatomy refinement, which had granted him greater cognitive abilities. So he was able to assess how he felt about things and what was the smarter decision to make. Just as Reiko was deciding to walk away, ignoring the snake and letting their feud continue, he thought about all the things he had experienced. Anatomy refinement, conquering territory and becoming a beast king, all of these things happened because of the snake that had entered his life. If it wasn't for that harrowing event, he would still be a nobody. Which, to be honest, wasn't all that bad because even if he was a nobody, he had no ambition and his life was never in jeopardy as a great tiger. This thought made him feel like turning away from the snake again. But the key word ambition suddenly grabbed his attention. Of course, it wasn't actually that word, but it is what could be interpreted from his thoughts. He realized that ever since he began subjugating other species, this is the emotion that had occupied his thoughts. Thoughts of revenge? They would only come back whenever he encountered the snake and a fight was immediately started. Reiko was beginning to realize the immense lack of care he had for this so-called revenge. He never had time to think of such things and he always had fun every day when he increased his strength along with those in his territory. Reiko sighed. To think that an intelligent beast like him was being ridden by reflex ghost emotions, such a disgrace. It was this thought that enabled him to think of the other things both he and Draco had gone through, especially with the recent bout with the guardian of the forest. Thinking about how both he and Draco, two apex predators, being put into such a critical condition because of the mere presence of a herbivore of all things, Reiko felt a slight sense of companionship, the kind you feel when you and another overcome something dangerous together, especially with the situation as crazy as it was now. Reiko sighed one more time before reciprocating Draco's gesture and accepting his offer of friendship. Draco paused for a moment, seemingly stunned before turning around and slithering away. Looking at the view of his back, Reiko felt that the snake seemed to have become more mature, making him chuckle. He too turned away, walking back to his territory with a slow gait. Over on the other side of the central continent, the dragons had achieved complete domination over the western forest. Not only had they subordinated a few of the powerful beast clans, but they had taken it a step further to enslave or kill the rest. It was extremely brutal, but it couldn't be helped. Dragons were innately arrogant and they were very dominating. This led to them being very territorial. Add on the fact that no one else could contest with them, then you get a group of apathetically ruthless individuals. Fortunately, the humans in this forest had been taken as subordinates because of their great control over their bodies and minor ability to create things. Although the dragons had conquered the entire forest, they were mainly seen flying around a shockingly huge mountain that had managed to actually bypass the clouds like it was nothing. On this mountain there were 15 peaks with a built-in cave and ledge on each one, as if they were designed for some kind of flying beast to inhabit them. This was obviously not a naturally formed mountain. In fact, there was no such thing left after the world was almost destroyed prior to Eridel's appearance. This was something Eridel made when he knew he was going to be housing dragons. Eridel wasn't exactly sure, but he guessed that dragons loved high places, so he decided to give them this minor gift. And he wasn't wrong in doing so. Unsurprisingly, the dragons had been rallied under their very own beast king, or to be more specific, the Dragon King. It was the largest alpha dragon who had been bestowed with the razor-sharp spike at the tip of its tail as soon as it had evolved in the magical outburst. And it was this dragon who was housed in the cave at the highest peak. But what surprising was the aura of metal that this particular dragon radiated as he sat upon his proud peak. It was extremely rare for anything to have affinity with the metal element since there were barely any metals in the entire world, so how could someone gain enlightenment? There should be no one with metal affinity for thousands of years unless Eridel chose to speed up the process. But here was one lucky dragon who had managed to make a fortunate encounter. The truth was that when this dragon was proudly exploring his cave, he had encountered a bunch of glowing purple rocks that were emitting a lot of essence. Thinking that they would make him stronger just like magic herbs, he decided to eat them. To no avail, of course. Beasts were only capable of absorbing essence from flesh and herbs. In fact, that was the only way they could become stronger. There were very, very few cultivation techniques that beasts could use, and more often than not, they weren't that great anyway. Nevertheless, you would rarely see such things outside of a law world. As compensation, beasts had an outstanding efficiency in absorbing the essence from flesh and herbs. Only someone with Yorma with her earth-devouring bloodline could absorb a percentage of essence from whatever she ate. This ability only grew stronger as her bloodline evolved, but that's besides the point. Enlightened species and others could absorb energy from the air through techniques, but their ability to absorb the essence from flesh and herbs was just too low. Fortunately, they could make pills with alchemy, saving a lot of essence from a herb, but there was nothing they could do about the meat. The only reason the blood fiends had such a shockingly high efficiency in absorbing blood was because the amount of essence in blood was incomparable to what was in the flesh. So although it was still unfairly high, it wasn't so balance-breaking. But if they ever encountered a species that contained their essence in their blood. As for the monster species, they grew stronger by killing. Of course, Eridel could have changed things, but he was fine with how they were. He liked how all the different factions had different ways of cultivation. What? You want to know about the monsters? More on that later. Back on the Dragon King, he decided to eat these so-called stones that were actually magic crystals intending to absorb the essence inside of them. But these were crystals that had evolved when the magical outburst had occurred. Not only were they products of the world, meaning anything under Realm 4 was incapable of damaging them, they were also magic metals, making them even harder. As a result, the almighty Dragon King lost a good amount of teeth. After howling in pain for a few minutes, the Dragon King finally calmed down. But instead of being resentful, the king was actually ecstatic. He could sense that other than magic energy, there was some other kind of essence. And it was of course the metal essence. His brethren had already decided to comprehend other elements like water, wood and air, but most commonly fire. How could they comprehend fire, you say? Well, the dragons had discovered a mysterious never-ending violet-colored flame in the Dragon Mountain's biggest cave. The flame was extremely hot and not something they could come close to without suffering severe consequences. But more on the truth of this flame later. The Dragon King was also one of those that studied these flames and eventually gained the qualifications to absorb the smallest of residues from the flame, gaining a fire affinity just like the others who had done the same thing. But unlike others, he felt that he could comprehend another element. This was not something that was normally possible. When you gained an elemental affinity, the truths of other elements were forever barred until you gained the mental capacity. Only the genius amongst the geniuses could gain another affinity whenever they wanted. Keep in mind that being born with 2 elemental affinities wasn't the same as being born with one and comprehending another. The latter was just too rare and way too hard to accomplish. Yet here we were, discussing another of this Dragon King's ridiculous talents. The Dragon King could have chosen something else to study like water or earth, but his pride prevented him from doing so. Such things were so common and their capabilities were so low, so how could he content himself with that? Discovering this hidden metal element was like a godsend to him and he refused to waste this opportunity. So a situation where a dragon held a glowing crystal in his hand and stared at it as if it contained the truths of the world occurred for 5 years. 5 years passed before the Dragon King had successfully comprehended the metal affinity. Now all he had to do was absorb the metal essence from the crystals, something he could now do. Whether it was metals, flames, or water etc., it was impossible to absorb their respective elemental essences without having the corresponding comprehension or affinity. If you only had the comprehension, you gained the affinity; if you had the affinity, you gained more power. It was that simple. And now, the Dragon King was gifted with the opportunity to gain a second affinity. Naturally, he accepted it with open arms, absorbing the metal essence with no hesitation. As for the magical energy inside the crystals, it was impossible to obtain without special methods. After that, a few years passed where the Dragon King sparred with his fellow brethren and tempered his killing intent using the lives of other species, mostly the slaves. It was cruel, but such was the law of the beasts. Eventually, the Dragon King broke through and became a stage 1 spirit beast. But when he did so, grand changes took place. The goal of the spirit beast stage was to enhance your soul or to the best of your ability. Most living things had souls, but the souls of beasts before the spirit beast stage were just so useless that you might as well ignore it completely. Their souls were just so incapable of capability that thoughts eluded them and their instincts controlled their every action. Of course, there were special cases and talented races, but the majority of beasts were like this. But everything changed when you became a spirit beast. You gained the same soul power that the enlightened had, gaining the average enlightened species intelligence at stage 9, you gained the spirit sensibility and you gained the ability to converse telepathically. These were all great boons that the enlightened species were denied when they entered Realm 2, mana refinement. More importantly, in every realm breakthrough that a beast went through, they gained the chance to evolve. If they were talented enough, they had the ability to encode their comprehensions and affinities that they gained throughout their lives into their very DNA. This not only made their skills as smooth as breathing, it made those skills stronger and more engineered for them. For example, for a dragon that became a fire dragon, his flames were no longer just flames. They were now dragon flames. But most importantly, their offspring would be born with their abilities, with the more powerful ones being locked until they had the power to use them. As it stands, races like the dragons would always evolve each realm breakthrough. They were just that talented, it is what it is. And that is exactly what the Dragon King was going through. Black scales were shed as the Dragon King roared in agony, his teeth and claws shattered like glass and his horns along with his tail spike were reduced to powder, his eyes bled and gallons of blood leaked out of his mouth. Clearly, something had gone wrong with his organs. When the reverse scale was suddenly but ruthlessly torn from the Dragon King, his roaring stopped and his shaking stilled, he seemed to have calmed down. But if you looked closer, the king seemed a little strange. He was crazily twitching like a fish out of water and his eyes were extremely unfocused, rapidly looking in every direction like a deranged mental patient. Just as it seemed that it couldn't get any worse, disgusting amounts of impurities started to slowly seep out of his pores, indicating that he was undergoing anatomy refinement. It looked quite painful. And indeed it was. The reverse scale of a dragon was simultaneously their toughness defense and biggest weak point. Whenever this defense was breached, it would cause unholy amounts of pain. But soon, things began to look up for the Dragon King. I mean, could it still be called an evolution if all it did was bully you? The Dragon King began to grow and suddenly roared with rage as he looked up at the skies. What? Did he want to burn the heavens or go against fate if fate goes against him? Maybe he was thinking of breaking through the firmament and covering the world with his wings? Who knew what this lizard was thinking? But soon, as they continued to roar, the most beautiful of scales began to develop all over his body. They were an alluring magenta color that tantalized the eyes, their faint transparency akin to that of crystals and their twinkling lights reminiscent of the stars. It was like his scales had been forged from the magic crystals that he had been studying for the past 5 years. His claws, horns and tailspike regrew and they were also crystal-like, but these a deep violet color with a strangely enchanting but menacing light that periodically pulsed like a beating heart. The pressure they emitted was as if it was threatening to cause laceration just by looking at it. Naturally, his teeth were not left out, thankfully they weren't also purple but the regular white, but the reflective luster they had were not normal at all. Each and every tooth was like that of a blade's edge. Looking at all these features, one would almost think that his eyes would take on the same appearance, but they did not. His eyes were fairly normal, a white sclera and whatnot, but that's where the normality of it ended. His iris was actually a ridiculous purple that seemed to be made from blazing flames and the fact that there were no pupils made them look like two purple suns, making anyone that looked into them feel intimidated. Roar! Orange flames erupted around the Dragon King's body, burning all the impurities as he simultaneously roared with flames erupting from his mouth. There was obvious excitement and pride on his face, filled with glee at his accomplishments, and you couldn't blame him. Looking at the crystal-like scales that covered the dragon from head to toe, one couldn't help but be awed. It seems that his 5-year seclusion was not in vain. He did not comprehend the metal element per se, but the more elusive crystal element. This was a branch element of metal that was extremely hard to understand and something that was rare to see even in law worlds. It was much rarer than comprehending the element of ice, which was the branch element of water, so the fact that this Dragon King could obtain it was the best indicator of his seemingly rising talent. As for why he had obviously entered the anatomy refinement, this wasn't actually unexpected. In fact, if he didn't enter anatomy refinement, that meant that something had definitely gone wrong. Most races that had something like the earth element or the metal element would undergo anatomy refinement when they evolved for the first time. This was because the severe damage that they suffered and, sometimes, recovered from when reforging their bodies with that element as a base was just too savage. Especially those of the scaled races like dragons. Their entire scales were shredded, including their reverse scale, just so that they could become earth or metal etc. scales. They would naturally benefit from surviving such an ordeal. Roar! 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 A sudden pandemonium of noises erupted as each dragon rose into the air, flying around their king as they roared their zealous praises and congratulations. Hail! Hail! All hail the king! In the central continent, nothing else worth mentioning happened within the first 30 years of Eridel's seclusion. However, the world was much bigger than just the central continent. Over in the western continent, Chad, the only phoenix and most powerful being in the continent, should have had the easiest time out of all the powerhouses in this world. He had power, status and women. What more could a beast want? His future was bright and unbarricaded, so there should have been no problems. But unfortunately, that couldn't be further from the truth. While he was powerful and had all he could want, he wasn't prepared at all for things to go oh so wrong. Unlike the other powerhouses, Chad had decided to have children fairly quickly. The thing about having children as a beast is that you would always be weakened as a result of it. Most of the time it was negligible, but the stronger your race, the more weakened you would be when trying to create more of this race. This is the reason why the other beast powerhouses had refrained from bearing children, waiting on the time for everything to be perfectly safe. But Chad is the most powerful person in his vicinity, so how could he have such misgivings? Plus, he had already had children before, but they were killed in the magical outburst, something that always weighed heavily on his mind, so he decided that he was ready to repopulate his clan once more. Unfortunately, Chad had failed to detect the threat that had been waiting patiently right under his nose. Chad had many subordinates, including humans, but there were 3 people that would always be closest to him. His 2 wives and his last surviving brother, whom we will call Honorable Brother for now. It's how Chad had been addressing him, not knowing the concept of names. All 3 of them were strange animals that looked like 2-meter-tall dodo birds, the next evolution after chicken. They were also lucky enough to have obtained the ice affinity, a result of a special treasure that Chad had provided them with after his adventure across the continent. They had already had water affinity thanks to being in the spring of life when they evolved, so upgrading that affinity to the ice affinity wasn't too hard for first-generation beasts like them, no matter how untalented their race was. Obviously, for Chad, who was a fire-aligned beast, there was no longer any compatibility between him and his wives. But despite this, he still decided to impregnate them. With his life energy and the fact that they were previously the same species, it was enough to smooth over the edges. Plus, he was the one that would be providing all the energy for the eggs, saving his wives from being drained just to support his children. Unfortunately, this meant that he would be the one weakened, providing the perfect chance that good old Honorable Brother had been waiting for all this time. A few days after Chad had gone into seclusion to recover his mana, Honorable Brother finally struck. With his stage 9 magic beast strength, he easily invaded the cave where the 2 wives had laid an egg each, ruthlessly killing the stationed guards on his way. When he entered and saw the 2 wives, he looked at them with an obvious lascivious desire in his eyes but quickly focused his attention on his true goal. The eggs of a phoenix. But more accurately, the essence and bloodline within. Yes, this Honorable Brother was actually coveting the bloodline of a phoenix in hopes that when he evolved at the spirit beast stage, he would overcome his limits and become a phoenix himself. This was the true reason why he had stopped cultivating when he became a peak stage 9 magic beast. With haste, he quickly kicked the 2 wives out of the way and grabbed the 2 eggs under his wings. Without hesitating, he quickly fled, knowing that he didn't have much time to glorify his easy success just yet. All the beasts started to squawk, roar or howl, when they heard the grievous news from 2 royal wives, enraged by the betrayal of their second-in-command. The stronger ones all began to rush out, intent on saving the king's children, but at this point the honorable brother had fled quite far. He was a stage 9 beast on the cusp of becoming a spirit beast after all. How could they catch him? Soon, he wasn't even in sight, and eventually, they lost him completely. A few hours later, Chad had finally been informed. Sheer! A heavenly phoenix cry filled with righteous wrath filled the air, scaring every living being that heard and even causing the weaker beings to bleed through their ears and faint. Alas, Chad could barely even move right now. For a female beast to provide the energy to rear a powerful baby, it's extremely exhausting and they would definitely be bedridden, and for a father to provide that energy it was even worse. So imagine the situation Chad would be in when he did it twice in one go? 1 week later. At this moment, the honorable brother was attempting to use the technique that Eridel had left as an inheritance for every beast. The evolutionary blood beast technique. This was a power technique that Eridel had inherited from the golden orb whose name and origin he still didn't know. It was supposed to be used on the off chance that when he finally collided with a core, it was a beast core, he would have the best technique to overcome his racial limits. This technique allowed one to use the blood of another beast to evolve, either taking aspects of that beast or becoming that beast and taking aspects of your previous race if your previous race was that trash in comparison. Of course, the technique that Eridel had passed on to the beasts of his world was heavily revised and had many limitations. The technique could only be used once in your entire life. You could only use the bloodline of a beast similar to yourself. For example, a bird should not use a wolf bloodline. If you ignored this, death is your only future. There had to be at least 70% compatibility. If not, death is your only future. The technique could only be used when you were evolving into a spirit beast. If you used it before then, death is your only future. Using the technique would take your entire cultivation base as compensation. There were other limitations, but those 5 were the ones that prevented the beasts from being hasty the most. With countless beasts dying every day from failure to meet the requirements, the more intelligent beasts were hesitant to try. And it was this technique that our great honorable brother was currently using. The honorable brother was currently hiding in a secret location that he had found many years ago. Since then, he had always been planning for this very moment. With mixed excitement and fear, he gathered the 3 materials he needed to complete the procedure and maximize his success. 2 phoenix eggs and a 20-year-old magic icicle. The 20-year-old magic icicle is a natural treasure, an icicle that had managed to survive a year without melting, henceforth obtaining the foundation to cultivate by absorbing magical energy and the ice essence in the area. The longer a magical icicle has lived for, the more essence it has managed to absorb, granting ice affinity cultivators and water affinity cultivators hoping to gain comprehension massive benefits if they were to obtain it. Of course, like with all things there were mutative cases here and there. In rare situations, the magic icicle absorbed more than just magical energy and ice essence causing a change in the icicle. But that's for another time. The magic icicle in the honorable brother's possession was a gift from Chad in his journey up north. The phoenix had managed to find a few of such things and guessed they would be of benefit to his wives and brother when he identified the similarity in essences between the icicle and Dodo the guardian of the forest, someone he had never forgotten. So he took them back to his brethren, extremely pleased with the subsequent results. He was glad that his few remaining clan members would be able to prosper with him. As a matter of fact, he focused most of his resources on his honorable brother because even though he could have chosen someone else with more talent, he wanted this brother of his that had been with him for such a long time to be his powerful right-hand man. But this is the result of his faithful dedication. A traitorous bird that was currently cracking open the eggs of his children and swallowing the contents. When the honorable brother had swallowed both eggs, he quickly huddled closer to the magic icicle before initiating his breakthrough to spirit beast realm and activating the evolutionary blood beast technique at the same time. Whum! A terrifying pressure was released from the honorable brother's body that sent the rocks and random debris around him flying against the walls of the cave that he was currently hiding in. The honorable brother squawked in pain as the hot phoenix bloodline ferociously infiltrated his veins, causing harrowing amounts of damage all over his body. This was a result of the titanic difference in bloodline levels, causing a situation where the phoenix bloodline was domineeringly erasing the inferior bloodline. On top of that, even if Chad was still a magic beast and as a result had not imprinted his fire and life laws into his DNA, he was still a fire elemental beast when he evolved in the magical outburst. This went against the nature of the honorable brother who had the ice affinity. With all these things against the honorable brother's favor, this normally would have resulted in his death. But 4 things were currently helping him. First was the magical energy being absorbed into him as a result of his breakthrough to the spirit beast stage. This, along with the magical energy in his beast core, was being used to nurture his body, preventing it from breaking down. But that alone was not nearly enough. Second was the fact that he was also evolving and becoming an ice elemental beast. This, along with the fact that he was desperately absorbing the ice essence from the 20-year-old magic icicle, helped him to offset the excessive heat from the bloodline. Third, the bloodline of the phoenix contained the life element, inadvertently healing him as he absorbed it, creating a cycle of destruction and restoration. And fourth was that both Chad and the honorable brother were both originally chicken, previously having the same bloodline and henceforth having some compatibility. This was actually the most important point. Without this minuscule bloodline connection, the result would have been complete failure. As an extension of the fourth reason, the phoenix bloodline he was absorbing was from a child between Chad and his 2 wives who were the exact same race as him, increasing the compatibility drastically. Now don't get things twisted, the phoenix bloodline was completely 100% phoenix. This was a result of how powerful the bloodline was, causing it to use the other bloodline as fuel instead of mixing. But nevertheless, the egg was nurtured in those wives, so there was still compatibility. All of these things contributed to saving his life and securing his success. Without pause, the honorable brother began to change. His height didn't grow, but his wings became larger and larger as his skeletal-muscular system began to rearrange itself. His head and beak shape changed, becoming smaller but more angular, projecting a beautiful and noble visage. His feet also changed, becoming bigger with the individual claws becoming more spaced out, giving it more room for any kind of use. Each claw was also very curved and extremely sharp, making them an entire weapon on its own. Honorable brother flapped his wings twice in excitement as the feathers on his body began to glow brightly as shockingly light blue flames danced around them. This was a frightening phenomenon that showcased the honorable brother's new capabilities. The evolution had actually forced the equilibrium between the ice and fire essences to undergo a terrifying fusion, causing the 2 opposing elements to fuse and create something new, frost flames. The honorable brother didn't know this, but the scythe of death had just skimmed over his head. Without the fact that the honorable brother also obtained the life elemental essence from the bloodline, whilst also gaining life affinity, that nurtured the process, even though the evolutionary blood beast technique worked and he would have managed to live, he would have become an abomination. Unless he had a technique to fuse the 2 essences, it would cause the evolution to fail, and he would become an abomination. Though it would have belonged to the extremely powerful kind with the fire and ice essence fighting against each other, refining themselves as the life essence restored the damage. Come to think of it, this would have been an extremely dangerous abomination, but fortunately, for the residents of the world, the opportunity was missed. The previously mentioned compatibility had caused ice and fire essences to be very slightly hesitant to harm each other, since they were tied to the 2 bloodlines at the time. This hesitation gave the life element enough time to mediate the differences between the 2 and narrowly escape a terrifying result. Soon, the process was complete. All the magical energy in the honorable brother's body had vanished, but he had accomplished his goal. He had become a phoenix, but not only that, he had become something different to his brother, an ice phoenix. If Eridel was watching, he would have been mentally clapping his hands with excitement whilst contemplating throwing a divine tribulation at the so-called honorable brother. He really hated betrayal, but it is what it is. On a side note, the only reason this honorable brother was still 2 meters tall was because he had lost all of his cultivation, becoming a regular animal that wasn't even a stage 1 magic beast. He should be glad he didn't become smaller instead. And yet, in spite of all his gains, a greedy and cunning expression etched itself on the phoenix's face as the image of 2 dodo-looking birds entered his mind. He wasn't done quite yet. "Oh dear brother, how are you doing now? Are you taking good care of yourself? Oh, please be well when I see you again." A look of disdain flashed on the phoenix's face as he flapped his wings and flew out of the cave with shocking speed. As he rose into the air, he gave out an ear-piercing phoenix cry, not unlike that of his brother. "Ha ha, I always wanted to do that." Whilst the Western continent experienced turbulent changes, the high humans in the Eastern continent continued to prosper under the rule of their queen. Despite the queen's lack of knowledge, she was just way too smart. She had been able to steer her fellow high humans onto the path of supremacy fairly quickly, and not only that, their ability to create wasn't lacking in the least. Not only had they managed to build primitive homes made out of wood and thatch, but they had even learned how to make a few pieces of furniture, for example a bed made from the hides of various beasts. Normally it was very hard to harvest the materials of nature such as wood, you would only be able to grab things like broken off twigs and sometimes branches, and that was if you were lucky. But the queen was smart enough to realize that she could use these rarely found branches and such as tools to obtain more materials. The high humans would crudely slam their branches onto harder objects like stones with the purpose of getting it to snap. When they accomplished this, a sharp edge was created and many possibilities were now open. This is how they dug holes all those years ago, but now they used them for many different purposes. In fact, one of the activities they used them for was fighting. Indeed, they used broken wood branches as weapons. Now, this couldn't be compared to the blood fiends who were using the much more dangerous stalactites, but that was something they had found due to luck. Unlike the high humans who were swiftly developing the idea of crafting, soon they would make better tools than broken branches. In fact, it was these broken branches that allowed them to subjugate various beast clans and rapidly expand their territory that consisted of half the southern region of the eastern continent. But it wasn't only their tools that made up their strength. Because of their great intelligence, not only did they discover how to use tactics in battle, but they had something that most of the world was missing: martial arts. They weren't like the barbarians who only know how to clobber with their fists, nor were they like the blood fiends that would only know how to stab with their stalactites. The high humans had actually discovered how to make specific maneuvers with their weapon to inflict the most damage. And naturally, the queen was the greatest in this regard. For her, calculating the distance, angle and velocity in order to create the most perfect strike at the most opportune time was as easy as blinking. The queen was a terrifying and unrivaled existence that would definitely take a main seat at the summit of the world. On that note, the queen had managed to break through to the third stage of the mana refinement realm, almost catching up to the queen of the elves, Titania. This was a result of her very own personalized cultivation technique that she was currently developing and improving every day. For now she called it Path of the Sun, even though it had nothing to do with the sun. But it was indeed suitable for people with light elemental mana formed from light essence instead of magical energy. She was also able to revise the cultivation technique that all enlightened beings were given and create an improved version that was more compatible with the high human race that even children could use. This caused their average cultivation to be at level stage 5 of body refinement stage, with the most talented being at stage 8. Speaking of children, the high human offspring were so talented and smart that they were able to begin cultivating at the average age of 4. 5 being the latest and 3 the quickest. On a side note, the queen was currently creating a language after gaining inspiration from the monkeys. The way they made different kinds of sounds consisting of screeches and howls as they looked at each other before performing certain actions made her think they were communicating somehow, something that embarrassed her greatly when she thought of her own race's inability to converse. But that naturally didn't last long. She was soon able to form words that had specific meanings, plus, they sounded much nicer than the crude sounds that the beasts made. The queen is indeed intelligent. Southern continent, central forest. In an unknown location of the forest was a pond surrounded by verdure. A black-scaled rhino entered the scene through a bush, seemingly intent on taking a drink. It was a powerful stage 6 magic beast. The rhino calmly ducked its head and lapped up the water in big gulps. Beautiful trees and bushes, a bright sun and a clear spring. It created a wonderful scene of nature. But that was only how it looked. Anyone actually here would be able to notice the tension that was so thick that it was almost tangible. Something was seriously wrong with this place. For starters, it was completely quiet. No chirps of birds, no sounds of insects, no sounds of squirrels running through trees and bushes. It was completely silent save for the sound of the rhino drinking water. Second was the faintly noticeable blood stains that could be seen here and there. In fact, in every direction you looked, you would be able to see blood stains if you focused. Even more suspicious was the random piles of ash, but it was so fine-grained and dust-like. What could burn to this extent? Something was clearly RSHSHSHSSHSSH. The sound of rustling leaves suddenly broke out, destroying the fragile image of peace. The rhino was no longer alone and there were now 5 strange creatures surrounding it. They looked like tiny yet humanoid beings with green skin and large wrinkly heads. They had black beady eyes, jagged teeth and sharp claws. Out of the 5, 4 of them were at the 4th stage of the first realm, with the last one being at the 5th stage. He was also the tallest, standing at 80 centimeters tall. Clearly, he was the leader. The rhino snapped up its head in fear, but when it saw their low cultivation levels, it snorted in anger. A group of trash dared to confront it? But although the rhino was full of rage, it didn't make a peep. It knew better than to make a commotion and draw unwanted attention to itself in this godforsaken forest. As the rhino contemplated on which insect to attack first, the 5 creatures suddenly sprang at him. Clearly, they weren't afraid to make the first move. These hideous creatures had a spine-chilling red aura around them that was filled with killing intent. If there was someone from another world here to see this scene, they would be shocked. Since when was killing intent visible? The rhino was startled at first but snorted once more in disdain. He was a stage 6 magic beast with defense as his primary ability. Could these little rats even harm him? The rhino lowered his head so that his horn was poised to deal fatal damage and charged at the closest opponent. Unfortunately, the rhino was too heavy and slow whilst the strange creature was extremely nimble. He easily dodged to the side before jumping towards the rhino's flank with outstretched claws. SWIP. Shockingly enough, the strike was able to breach the tough defense of the rhino's tough scales, inflicting sharp pain on the beast. But strangely enough, the rhino only grimaced. He was still unwilling to make any sounds that could draw attention to himself, so he suppressed his desire to roar. Moreover, he was secretly terrified. How could such weak creatures harm him? Should he run? But before he could make a decision, all 5 creatures leapt to him at once with perfect synergy, and it was at this moment the rhino knew that he was done for. But he will make them pay a severe price. And so a silent battle of life and death continued like this. Claws flashing and jagged teeth snapping, a fatal horn puncturing and massive feet stomping. Soon the rhino was on its last legs and covered in blood as it heaved heavily. On the other side there were only 2 of those strange creatures remaining. The leader and one of its henchmen. Those 2 were also covered in bruises from the times they got rammed into, but there was no blood on them, unlike their 3 fallen brethren that now looked like mashed up meat. Despite this, they sported hideous grins as they looked at their prey that seemed like it was going to collapse at any moment. As they limped forward, "Yoorah!" The rhino suddenly let out a thunderous roar that resounded throughout the forest and used the last of his strength to charge at the creature closest to him, which happened to be the leader. Obviously he had no more qualms about arousing attention to himself anymore. In fact, the thought of what would happen filled him with savage glee. The leader of the 2 remaining creatures was flabbergasted by the turn of events. He hadn't expected the beast to still possess so much energy, causing him to be unable to react. Clearly, the rhino had been pretending. On top of that, the roar had a slight stunning effect which almost cost him his life. Luckily, he was able to break out of the effect and safely dive to the side. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said about his last remaining follower. Although his follower leapt to the other side, he was too slow, and as a result his shoulder was pierced. A green arm was sent flying into the air. The creature was shocked. Whose arm was that? Was it the leader's? But a sudden devastating pain assaulted his senses, causing him to look at the origin of the pain. But what he saw nearly shocked him to death. Iowa! The creature screamed in agony as it looked at its remaining stump that began to bleed profusely with terrified eyes. He was finished, he knew it. Actually, he would be able to survive that kind of injury. Beings of its kind wouldn't die from something like that. But it was not the injury that concerned him. His eyes, filled with terror, quickly looked towards his leader. At this point, the rhino had finally collapsed dead. It had used the rest of its energy and no longer had the ability to preserve its life. Today, a mighty stage 6 magic beast that could be amongst the upper elite in any other part of the world had fallen prey to the law of the jungle like a common beast. What's worse is that it was defeated by strange creatures that only had one being at stage 5. What a grand humiliation. But the leader of these creatures didn't care in the slightest. Although a look of extreme glee covered its face, it knew it didn't have much time. That last roar of the rhino had definitely revealed their location and he needed to escape. But it stubbornly waited for something. What could it? SSSSSSSSS. The rhino started to deflate like a balloon. 10 seconds later, it had turned into a big pile of ash that wasn't any different to the other random piles of ash, only, this pile was quite large. Now, it was obvious how they came to be. A hair-raising red-colored mass of essence suddenly coalesced itself above the pile of ash before splitting into 2 portions, the much bigger portion flying to the leader whilst the other flew towards the scrub. The strange essence was filled with all sorts of resentment, grievance, vengeance and other negative emotions, including killing intent. If this was absorbed by anyone, there was a very high chance of it affecting their psyche. But the leader wasn't worried at all. It watched his portion come with obvious excitement, and the reason became obvious when the strange energy fused with his body. Like clockwork, his own peculiar aura from before burst out of him once more, but this time it was much bigger and denser. He had broken through. The leader had now entered stage 6, and likewise, the same process repeated itself in the other creature, and it entered stage 5 even though the portion it obtained was much smaller. But for some reason, there was no happiness on its face at all, unlike the leader that was cackling loudly. It only looked wary. When it saw its leader snap its attention toward him, it didn't hesitate to run away. Unfortunately, the leader was much stronger and caught up in no time. With an evil grin on its face, it plunged its hand through its comrade's back with a heart appearing in its hand when it went through the other side. There was no guilt or remorse on its face, only deranged exhilaration. The same thing that happened to the rhino repeated itself with the creature, and it was soon reduced to ash. The resulting killing essence that was released was quickly absorbed by the leader, making its own aura rise again, but clearly it wasn't enough for it to break through. Drunk on its rising power, it began to laugh wildly as ambitious and cruel thoughts circulated in its head. I, a monster of the goblin race, will dash. Crack! The creature that was now revealed to be a goblin and a monster was now missing its head. Dumb. An enormous 3-meter-tall monster that was also humanoid but pink-skinned with a literal pig head and giant fangs appeared behind the deteriorating corpse of the goblin. It too was able to absorb the resulting killing essence from the goblin when it was reduced to ash. The killing intent aura that was exclusive to the monster species burst out of its body, revealing the strength of a stage 8 beginner monster. Looking at its appearance, wasn't this an orc? Meh. The orc was obviously disappointed in its gains. A stage 6 beginner monster probably wasn't much to him. Suddenly, its head snapped up, the picture of alertness and fear on its face. Without hesitation, it dashed into the bushes, fully intent on deserting this place. I dash. Half a minute later, the sound of a pig screaming rang out before it was cut off. A red light filled with killing intent appeared in the direction the orc had run off. Clearly, it had been killed by another monster, and by the look of things it was a stage 1 intermediate monster. Monsters were another type of species altogether different from the beasts and enlightened races. Killing was the only way they gained strength, and killing was the only way they survived. Numerous scenes like this appeared throughout the entire continent, filled with monsters and the even more terrifying blood fiends. Welcome to the southern continent, where there's only one rule. Kill or be killed. Southern continent, at the very center of the central forest. Sitting on top a large boulder was a creature that looked like a 4-armed, gray-skinned ogre. It was 3 meters tall, extremely muscular, and had 2 tusks reaching out from its mouth. It also had long black hair, pointed ears, and abyssal black eyes. Last but not least were the jagged black horns on the sides of his head. This was Azura, chief of the savage earthen ogre tribe, and a rank 9 intermediate monster. A strength that far surpassed both the queen of the elves and the queen of the high humans. The savage earthen ogre tribe was a clan of ogres that had mutated when the magical outburst had arrived. They used to be like every other ogre, with the regular characteristics of muscular, 2 meters tall, green skin, pointed ears and sharp tusks. But the savage earthen ogre tribe was clearly different, with their height that averaged 2.5 meters tall, their gray skin and their perfect affinity with the earth element. Given the fact that Azura has a name, it was obvious that he was either someone Eridel had tampered with or someone Eridel had acknowledged before his seclusion. Actually, his story was quite interesting. The truth was that this tribe was actually quite special, considering the fact that they had 3 people that Eridel had blessed in here. Azura, Babunda and their chief, Chrysos. Eridel had constructed a mutated Earth-grade physique that was tailored for monsters and bestowed it to them and a few others. A physique is the genetic makeup of the physical body, but when people speak of the term physique in a world of cultivation, they are normally talking about a special body that was bestowed by fate and sometimes came with powers. Physiques could be split into 5 grades: mortal, earth, heaven, ageless and void. Mortal grade was what everyone else currently had, and it could also be considered nothing, but people from high worlds would call it talentless, while people from low worlds would call it trash. As for the people above, they would look at you with pity, as if you were a cripple that lacked all your limbs. They had absolutely zero innate talent. But don't let the term innate talent confuse you. When it came to physiques, innate talent was something like a guarantee. For example, someone with an Earth-grade physique was guaranteed to make it to the 4th realm of cultivation with no bottlenecks, and as long as you didn't suffer extensive damage then you would make it. There would never be a need to worry about stabilizing your cultivation because it was permanently stable before the 4th realm. After that would be your own hard work. On top of that, if you somehow decided that you wanted to enter cultivation when you were already an old man, as long as you didn't die you would still make it to the 4th realm eventually. Unlike other old men who were barred from cultivation completely. Heaven grade guaranteed the 7th realm. Ageless grade guaranteed the 9th realm. Void grade guaranteed the? So no, having 0 innate talent didn't mean you wouldn't make it to the top, it just meant that you would have to work many times harder than people who had innate talent on top of having to face bottlenecks. As for Azura and the others? They had mutated Earth-grade physiques. And don't you dare let the term mutated fly over your head. A mutated physique was one that could upgrade to the next level if you met the requirements. This was something extremely rare to see but even harder to accomplish. Most people didn't even know if they had mutated physiques, and even if they did, how could they know the requirements? Was their own body supposed to instruct them? As a result, unless you had someone akin to a seer, you would need extreme luck to find and consume the needed ingredients. That being said, a system aka the best guide in existence would soon bless this world's residents. Unless they were retarded they would never be lost. Sometimes a physique comes with extra powers, traits or perks. For example, the physique that Azura and a few other monsters had named the Divine Demon Physique. This physique granted them the following. 1. Divine IQ, above mortal intelligence from birth. 2. Divine Monster, purifying killing essence when you absorb it. 3. Divine Presence, everyone facing you would feel like you were an existence that came from above. Monsters would especially revere you, and enemies will instinctively fear you, causing them to be unable to fight against you with their full power. 4. Divine Ruler, all those that follow you will be influenced by your thoughts and decisions. If you want to be a good ruler you will have good subordinates, if you want to be an evil ruler you will have evil subordinates. 5. Divine Demon, the stronger you are the more attractive you become. You obtain 2 curved horns on the sides of your head that are extremely attractive to monsters of the opposite gender and intimidating to those of the same gender. The horns will always be on the side of your head and will always curl upwards, but the design of those horns will match your personality. As a result, if you experience any grand changes in personality, so will your horns. You will also obtain personalized killing essence. No longer will your killing essence and killing intent be red in color like other monsters unless red is your personal favorite color. 6. Divine Damnation, shoot a condensed beam of pure killing essence. 7. Free from fate? As you can see, the Divine Demon Physique only had one attack ability but had many perks/traits. Physique powers are generally balanced out like this, but it should also be mentioned the Divine Demon Physique was extremely powerful for its Earth grade. It is definitely amongst the best of its kind. Azura, Babunda and Chrysos all had this physique. But as Eridel willed it, only one was meant to remain. Before this tribe had experienced the magical outburst, the tribe was led by the ogre named Chrysos. Chrysos was a charismatic and intelligent ogre that led his clan to reign supreme in the Central Forest, and even the indomitable Azura and ferocious Babunda were fiercely loyal to him. The other tribes could only fend off this ogre tribe if they teamed up with each other because their power alone was insufficient, and without forming alliances they would be decimated. The reason for the tribal leader's strength was not only because of special physique, but all because of the unique gift that Eridel had given him. In fact, every monster that was bestowed the Divine Demon Physique was also gifted with a unique item which would later on become to be known as a Demon King's armament. Chrysos was gifted with a stone mountain. Indeed, it was a stone mountain, but the size, weight and position could be freely adjusted by the user depending on their cultivation level. On top of that, the stone mountain emitted endless earth-killing essence that was beneficial to all monsters with earth affinity. This armament was called the Heavenly Demon Mountain. With the power of this armament, Chrysos along with the talented Azura and Babunda were able to mutate their killing essence into earth-killing essence. This was the same as someone forming their mana from an element, for example, the High Human Queen's light elemental mana. A mutated killing essence would still be red in color, but it would have an extremely different feeling from the rest. Killing intent normally feels like feeling like someone was going to just kill you, but earth-killing intent felt like someone wanted to crush you into pieces. On top of that there was an added gravity effect that prevented you from using full power. Moreover, when using earth-killing essence in attacks like what those goblins did, each attack would be especially heavy. You could also circulate around your body to have a mountain-like defense. A mutated killing essence was 5x stronger than the elemental mana's counterpart but just as hard to obtain. Consequently, the other ogres in the clan weren't talented enough to absorb the mutated killing essence and could only be like everyone else. Or that should have been the case. However, the magical outburst came around, and just like with the barbarian chief, an unknown criteria was met and Chrysos evolved into a high ogre with perfect earth affinity. He reached 2.7 meters tall, gained gray skin akin to the heavenly demon mountain, horns that looked like they were carved from a rock, and silver eyes. But Chrysos was not the only one to evolve. As Chrysos' loyal followers, his entire tribe including Azura and Babunda evolved, becoming the savage earthen ogre tribe of today, with all members wielding the earth-killing essence. This was definitely something terrifying, and even otherworlders would think 3 times before fighting this tribe that they had seen nothing alike before. After all, monsters were something that only existed in this world. They were already horrifying, and for some mutated existences like the savage earthen ogre tribe to exist as well? Wasn't Eridel cheating too much? But that was not all. If Chrysos could meet the requirements to evolve, how can Azura and Babunda fail to do so? Let's rewind a bit. A greatsword, a halberd, a battle-axe, a warhammer. These are 4 different red-colored weapons that radiated killing essence were placed in front of Azura. The first ever weapons in the world, and Azura was given the right to pick one. And not only that, these weapons were made from a special metal that was almost impossible to create and could never be formed naturally. It was killing metal. Killing metal was similar to magic metal in that it could absorb killing essence to cultivate itself. When this metal was used to kill, it would absorb some of the killing essence to empower itself, meaning that this was a weapon that could grow with the user. Obviously, the best users were monsters, but it wasn't impossible for others to use it. But for 4 of such weapons to be placed in front of one person, even immortals would become envious. Eridel gifted Azura 4 weapons because he knew that these weapons were too heavy to be dual-wielded, so you could only choose one and discard the rest. Giving them to someone else wasn't feasible either, as it would be like someone other than Thor trying to pick up Mjolnir, so the goal was that Azura chose one of the 4 weapons that he was most compatible with, and when he accomplished that, he would gain a permanent connection with it. It would no longer be too heavy for him, and he would gain martial art techniques specific to that weapon. The rest of the weapons would be destroyed. Unfortunately, Azura flipped the script. Eridel was too used to dealing with the primitive minds of the residents of his world and forgot that as a monster with the divine demon physique, Azura's intelligence was definitely not low. CK. Who was Eridel? He was a 2,000-year-old world that had an unknown soul level. He was definitely up there with the top 10 smartest existences in the universe. How could something that he gave the ogre escape his calculations? That being the case, even though he knew that he had left a loophole, Eridel wanted to leave it up to fate. If Azura could grab this opportunity, then so be it. Azura studied each weapon carefully. He knew they were very powerful, and if he could grasp the power of just one of them, then his strength would be below the chief's and above the rest. Even Babunda shouldn't be able to match him. Azura picked up the sword and examined it closer. As he did so, he could feel a familiar prompt that seemed to want to form a contract with him. Azura exerted all his power into both hands to swing with an overhead strike. Crack! The ground exploded as a 2-meter-long fissure was created when the sword connected with the ground. If Eridel was here to watch this, his core would probably crack from anger. After practicing with the sword for a few minutes, he let it drop heavily to the ground before collapsing himself with sweat drenching his body. Whew! Azura looked at the surroundings that were even more destroyed than before and couldn't help but marvel at his power, even though the weapons were currently in a sealed state. He didn't know he was courting deletion. Azura quite liked the sword because of how versatile and easy it was to use. Out of all the weapons he currently had, this was the one that appealed to him the most, and if he had to choose, he would definitely go with the sword. But he didn't want to choose. He had spent quite a lot of time with each weapon by now, and each of them had their own uses that he couldn't think of going without anymore. The destructive lethality of the battle-axe, the speed and dexterity of the sword, the long reach and power of the halberd, and last but not least the unblockable strength of the warhammer that could also double as a shield. Azura looked at all 4 weapons before sighing. What should I do? Is what could be interpreted from his thoughts. Azura dragged the sword to the rest of the weapons before picking up the halberd. It was customary for him to practice with each weapon every day. Although the weapons were too heavy to take into battle, they at least served to train his muscles. He could feel his body becoming stronger each day, and it had nothing to do with his daily killings. Gaining power was his primary focus, and if there was any way to increase it, then he wouldn't hesitate. This world was too chaotic, and everywhere you looked people died. So if he didn't want to end up as someone else's nourishment, he needed to obtain more power. A power that would allow him to be invincible, a power that would allow him to control his fate and break out of the cycle of endless killing, a power that would allow him to set order to this ravaged world. Yes, that was his purpose. Azura's eyes glowed with passion as he began to think of what he should do with his power that was only matched by Chrysos and Babunda. He knew the three of them were different. Ever since he first came to be, he knew there was something seriously wrong with the others, including his own tribe members. They always killed and killed and killed, and there was never any reason for it. Even if it was exhilarating to gain strength, must they kill so excessively? Why should they so mindlessly take the lives of others? Azura didn't have any knowledge about good and evil, but his heart still skipped a beat when he thought of how those that had been ashed were never seen again. Was that really it for them? Did a mere claw in their heart or slice to the neck really forever banish them from seeing the next day? Wasn't that too harsh? What if that happened to him or his brothers one day? Ashed is the term used when someone is killed by a monster. Most importantly, why was he not like the others? Why did the light of insanity that he saw in so many others not appear on him or Chrysos and Babunda? Why did he hesitate when the life of his enemies was in his grasp and he only needed to take one more step? Azura shook his head as doubts of the past tried to resurrect themselves. He knew his purpose now. Azura hefted the halberd high above his head before swinging back down with ferocious might. Boom! Looking at the new crater that joined the ones that decorated his surroundings, Azura smiled with content as shockwaves blew his hair and debris rained around him. Bringing order to this accursed world. That is my purpose. A couple months had passed and Azura had made tremendous progress. Thanks to his daily vigorous training, he was now able to dual-wield two of his weapons as long as the warhammer wasn't included. He was also now able to fight effectively with a weapon in battle as long as he only used one. This caused Chrysos and Babunda, who were always supporting, to congratulate him. They knew of his plight and were happy to see him return to the battlefield. It always confused them when they saw how Azura's armaments were inferior to theirs even though he had more. Even Babunda, with his pair of green glowing cuffs and dangling chains that didn't connect to each other, was stronger than Azura. Babunda's cuffs were called the shackles of the Juggernaut, and they augmented his body to make it tremendously powerful, especially his arms. If his arms or the chains themselves hit you, you were most likely going to die. On top of that, his vitality was also enhanced to terrifying levels that made the ogre almost undying. The reason the cuffs were green instead of red, despite it being made of the same killing metal, was because they had made a connection with Babunda and they took on the color of his killing essence, which was green. Maybe the more weapons you had, the weaker they were? This was the only theory that Chrysos and Babunda could come up with. Who knows? Time continued to flow as Azura continued to grow stronger each day, multiple times faster than before now that he returned to the battlefield and could now cultivate more killing essence. Soon, he was able to dual wield in battle even when he used the warhammer. His only lament was that he didn't have more arms to wield his other weapons. He was still very much unwilling to discard any of his weapons. Azura thought of Babunda's near-death experience in his fight against someone who was shockingly just like them. He knew that even if he chose one of his weapons and unlocked its full power, it still wasn't enough. He needed to find a way to unlock the power of all of them. So Azura continued to ferociously train with single-minded focus. At this point he had not slept normally for months. Now, swinging his weapons till he fainted each night was his night-night routine. Eventually the magical outburst arrived, changing things within the ogre clan forever. Azura had achieved the woefully rare double evolution, experiencing his own evolution whilst obtaining the blessings of Chrysos' evolution. When he evolved, his growing desire to wield all the armaments had actually manifested by giving him an extra pair of arms that enabled him to wield two more weapons. On top of that, he obtained a monstrous muscular strength that enabled him to wield each weapon with ease, making him an unblockable calamity to all of his enemies. But that was without the connection with any of his weapons. The day Azura made his connections with his weapons, the whole continent felt it. Azura was in a jubilant mood as he swung all four of his weapons through the bodies of his enemies with little resistance. The bodies of wraiths would either be split in half before dissipating into ash, or they would directly explode when they made contact with his warhammer. Just 7 days ago the whole world had experienced a great change that he couldn't comprehend. Even now his heart still palpitated when he thought of the series of events before his evolution. He really thought all life would end that day. But look at him now. Shick, Boom! Azura's axe crashed through 3 wraiths and the boulder behind them. Azura raised his head to the sky and roared as if he was an abomination from the abyss, causing both ogres and wraith alike to flee from fear. Soon, there was a 20-meter radius around him that lacked all life apart from plants. The abyss actually exists, more on that later. Anyone could hear the unparalleled pride and fury in that voice. Whether they saw the origin of this voice or not, they knew that this was not and would never be a normal person, this was a monster to the monsters. The battlefield even quieted for a few seconds as everyone looked at him with various emotions. The Wraith King looked at him with displeasure, with something else hidden deeper, before cutting off the heads of 2 ogres with an ominous-looking scythe. Babunda's 2 heads looked at him with respect and pride before leaping into a crowd of wraiths with his 4-meter-tall body. Chrysos looked at him with a strange emotion on his face before it quickly faded to indifference. He waved his hand, causing the flying mountain-shaped boulder in the sky to come crashing down on 3 unsuspecting wraiths. The rest of the ogres had mixing looks of fear and reverence. Whilst the wraiths, well, there were no emotions to be seen on a faceless entity, but the smoke-like substance that made up their bodies began to flicker erratically in an agitated motion. Wraiths were monsters that were, well, wraiths. They looked like Grim Reapers, a cloak made from a red smoke-like substance with the only other color being the black mist where the heads should have been. Each one had a solid red lantern that contained a skull in their left hand. As they resumed the battle, red mist-like skulls were shot out of the lanterns like fireworks. This was a wraith's main way of attacking, and as they flew, the sound of a flying missile was heard as the mouths repeatedly bit the air. When they connected with a target, they exploded with a loud bang. Really and truly, they weren't unlike fireworks. As for the Wraith King, Azura looked at him a little warily. Even with his adrenaline rush, he still knew to pay close attention to this being at all times. Wraiths were typically around 1.5 meters tall, but the Wraith King was a whole 2 meters tall. Instead of being red like the others, he was a dark gray. Only the black mist where a head should be was the same. Even the lantern in his hand was different, being a little bigger than the others and black in color. Most eye-catching was the sinister onyx black scythe wrapped in dark bandages that the Wraith King carried in his right hand, and the ghost-like horns on each side of its head. Azura could tell that the scythe wasn't much different from the weapons that he owned and the shackles that Babunda wielded. It was 2.5 meters tall, with the serrated and razor-sharp blade being 1.2 meters long. Such a sight would cause anyone's heart to skip beats, but that wasn't the cause of Azura's concern. As Azura watched, the wraith would disappear in a puff of black smoke before reappearing in a different location. He would then swing the terrifying scythe with both hands or lift up the lantern in his left hand to shoot out a multitude of black skulls. He had the ability to summon and unsummon the lantern. Each time he appeared, death would follow. He was a very strong and very terrifying individual. He was the one that nearly killed Babunda after all. 2 weeks ago, the savage Earthen Ogre tribe, but just a powerful ogre tribe back then, had encountered the Wraith clan. They didn't have the lanterns back then, nor were they even wraiths. They were phantoms, ghost-like figures with terrifying faces. Naturally, like any meeting between different monster factions, it was an instant war. And normally the savage Earthen Ogre tribe would have won, but not this time. In this battle, they met a phantom king that was black in color with 2 horns on its head that curled to the sky and a terrifying scythe. All monsters with the divine demon physique were smart and quick-witted, hence the 4 beings could easily recognize each other for what they were. But Azura didn't care too much. Although they were intelligent, the idea of communication barely existed in the same race, talk less of talking with other monsters, so the immediate thought was something along the line of, "There are 3 of us and 1 on the other side. There is no way we could lose." Ha! There are 3 of us and 1 on the other side. There is no way we could lose. Ha! They were definitely not prepared for the wraith to appear right behind Babunda and cut halfway into his neck, nearly sending his head flying. On top of that, a spine-chilling corrosion began to spread from that wound, and it never stopped. If Babunda didn't have the shackles of the Juggernaut's enhanced vitality to suppress it and the recent evolution to completely remove it, he would probably be dead. The big guy really had a close look at death that day. Azura speculated that that was probably the reason that Babunda gained another head and that disgusting amount of defense. His defense was already terrifying before as a result of his enhanced vitality from his armament, but now it was just sad. So sad. With the double defense from a tough body and extreme vitality, he was basically unkillable within the same realm. Even if you managed to break through his tough skin, tough muscles and even tougher bones, he would just heal it back very quickly. It was just so sad. Azura took a quick look at Babunda as he wreaked havoc on the wraiths. This was his brother. But he couldn't for the life of him understand what made the previous phantoms change so much. Those lanterns were seriously annoying, and the speed that the wraiths had when they moved was even more annoying. What was 4 times more annoying was the fact the other ogres couldn't use their weapons against the wraiths. The 3 ogre leaders were smart and quickly discovered the merits of using worldly objects as weapons when given inspiration from their own armaments. But unfortunately, it looked like only killing essence worked on the phantoms and even stronger wraiths, so since it was impossible for them to imbue killing essence into anything other than their own bodies or special items like weapons made from killing metal, they had to work with their fists. Even then, the ogres were still winning. This was a result of their special earth killing essence that made their attacks and defense quite daunting. But Azura knew that they weren't the only ones with a mutated killing essence. He could sense something multiple times more dangerous from the Wraith King's killing essence. Every time the Wraith King exposed his killing intent, it was always a terrifying experience. Azura felt like was looking at death itself each time, and it never got old. Looking at how each strike containing his killing scene would leave a terrifying corrosion that rapidly sucked all life from the victim, Azura knew that there was something seriously wrong about it. Luckily, the Wraith King spent most of his time hiding and sneak attacking, so at the very least his killing intent wasn't there to disturb everyone. Nevertheless, as Azura continued to cut down more wraiths, he made sure to keep track of the wraith's location at all times. He wasn't like Babunda. If he got struck by the Wraith Kings, he would most likely die regardless if the attack was fatal or not. Such an ability was quite unfair. BVVVT. The Wraith King had disappeared again. Azura had half a mind to wonder where he would appear next, scanning the battlefield for his next location. But when he didn't see him again, all the hairs on his body rose in alarm. Without hesitation, he thrusted his body forwards whilst simultaneously turning around to look at what was behind him. Right in his previous location stood nothing. Could his instincts be wrong? Then where was BVVVT? A brief and deep static-like sound that Azura knew all too well was heard right behind. He leapt forward with all his might as if a gate to the abyss had opened behind him, for if he didn't, only death awaited him. Why is this guy so dash? Thud. Huh? CSHHHHHH. Blood was abruptly splattered into the air. What just? AHHHH. Azura screamed like a banshee as he desperately tried to reach his back with all 4 arms, dropping his weapons in the process. Fear gripped his heart as his eyes looked in every direction in a terrified manner. He knew he had been hit, and he could already feel the terrifying corrosion that Babunda previously faced making an attempt for his life. But how? I escaped something block what BLO who BL? Who blocked me? Is what could be interpreted from his erratic thoughts. But he didn't have much time to think. Even in his half-crazed mind, he could feel the threat of fatality rising above his head. With all the effort he could muster, he leapt to the left. Something was clearly in front of him, so. Thud. Oh sure dash. CSHHHH. Blood splattered once more. NNNGH? This time, the scythe that was way too determined to kill him dug in deep into his shoulder before ripping itself out, almost taking one of his arms with it. At this point, the corrosion was already causing black veins to bulge against his skin, even making the blood that freely leaked from his body turn black in color. It was a very bad situation. But still, Azura bit down hard on his lip, not intending to waste energy screaming. He needed to focus on finding out what was sabotaging him. He knew that someone must have been clocking his escape somehow, because he was very sure his surroundings weren't treacherous like this before. Mustering all his mental power, Azura ignored the sharp pain from his wounds and the ice-cold corrosion that was slowly seeping into his body, focusing solely on the space around him. He needed to identify the cause of this clusterfuck. Arf! Azura ferociously dragged 2 of his hands to the object in front of him whilst opening his droopy eyes to the max to make sure he got a good look. But when he eventually managed to focus his eyesight onto the heinous object that was dead set on making sure he didn't leave with his life, his heart dropped. Impossible. K-Chrysos? Impossible. K-Chrysos? In front of Azura was a mountain-shaped boulder that he was very familiar with. It was the very treasure that made the savage earthen ogre tribe what they were today after all. The armament owned by the chief of the tribe, Chrysos. The one and only heavenly demon mountain. Azura could not believe his eyes. The mountain could only be controlled by Chrysos, so if it was indeed the same heavenly demon mountain and not some replica, didn't that mean that Chrysos had set it up to be that way? Azura was so shocked that he wasn't able to register the incoming threat. Kuhk. Azura spat out blood before looking down to see the blade of a scythe poking out of his stomach. As he watched, a much deeper corrosion than before began to spread out from the fatal wound. He was finished. He could feel it down to his soul, this was his end. Honestly, it wasn't so bad. At this point he couldn't feel very much, and to die in battle knowing that he had furthered the advancement of his race was a relief. But Azura slipped to his knees as all strength failed him. The corrosion not only attacked his life force, it had weakening effects that he was completely unable to fight against. So he could only shamefully land on his knees. The scythe was slowly dragged out of his body, but he didn't pay it any mind. He was already ready to die. But two hands grabbed his shoulders and forcibly but slowly turned him around. What were they doing now? Did they intend to sully the little honor he had left? Just as he was about to close his eyes and accept his death, he saw the identity of the person who had turned him around, and his heart fractured. Standing in front of him was Chrysos, who took 3 steps back to stand just a little behind the Wraith King. Like he was some kind of servant. Talk less of Azura, even the spectating ogres and wraiths were watching with shock and confusion. Various thoughts raged their way around Azura's head, but he still could not comprehend. Did Chrysos seriously help the Wraith King to kill him? Before, if it was only speculation, now it is certain. He had been killed by a member of his own race, which to be fair wasn't that abnormal. But this wasn't the same. Chrysos should not be driven by the lust of power. In fact, he didn't even seem to want to finish him off. The Wraith King would eat all the benefits from his death. So what was the meaning of this? Azura was too damaged to think too much. He was already going to die, so what could it possibly matter? Tuh! Azura spat out the blood that had been accumulating in his mouth. Ah! I am only embarrassing myself further. Azura's eyes drooped as his consciousness began to cede. He was going to die. But, thinking of Chrysos' face twisted with disdain, but I am not willing. HNNNG. Azura's eyes flipped open as he exerted his muscles to do something. His upper body dropped down as he began to slowly inch towards one direction. His weapons. Chrysos looked at Azura with disdain. Truly he didn't want to see something like this, but it couldn't be helped. Azura was becoming too strong and he couldn't have that. Chrysos was aware of an armament bond and knew once you formed the connection, you would gain immeasurable benefits. He would never let Azura achieve such a feat with 4 of them. What a joke. Where would his face as chief go then? Besides, now with his secret deal with the Wraith King, he was promised that he wouldn't be assassinated. Of course, he was smart and he didn't believe such a deal would last long, but it would give him enough time to kill Babunda and rise in strength. After killing the Wraith King, the tribe would only need him, the chief. But damn, this guy has lost all face for the savage earthen ogre tribe. Must he crawl like such a piece of trash? What a disgrace, just die with your little dignity. In his anger, he took the necessary steps forward to reach the dying Azura and kicked him hard. Do! Azura was suddenly sent flying, but in the process he passed out. It would seem that it was the end for. Clang! His body landed on the pile of weapons that he dropped before, but as his body began to twitch, the blood that never stopped flowing out of his body soaked each of the weapons, causing a very terrifying change in events. All 4 weapons began to illuminate with a bone-chilling red color that wasn't dissimilar from Azura's horns. Indeed, it was this red color that Azura had as his personal killing essence color. Different from the killing essence of others, it was a striking crimson that was comparable to a rose. But that didn't last very long. Slowly, Azura's horns began to turn black as they twisted in nature, developing chinks and cracks that portrayed an image of desolation and disaster. Correspondingly, the same process repeated itself in all 4 of Azura's weapons. The red light emitted by the 4 weapons was also converted into a dark color that reeked of despair. Soon, each weapon began to right itself as they floated into the air. Simultaneously, Azura's body began to float up with all his arms stretched out. Strangely, he was still unconscious. But the others weren't, and they were terrified. They could feel the world-destroying aura that all 4 weapons put together released, and they wanted nothing to do with it. So they fled with no hesitation, completely forgetting their respective leaders. The only ones who remained were the Wraith King, Chrysos and Babunda, who had long since been trapped under the heavenly demon mountain. But when both Chrysos and the Wraith King failed their best attempts to interrupt Azura, they too made the decision to flee. At this point, more shocking changes had been made to Azura's body. His previously 2.5 meter height had reached 3 meters and his bulky muscles had transformed, becoming narrower yet extremely prominent. His entire body had become streamlined, which was neither too big and neither too little, the epitome of male muscular perfection. Such a constitution was perfect for wielding all sorts of weapons. And naturally that was the point. Suddenly, all 4 weapons attached themselves to each of Azura's hands, causing a violent reaction to occur. Boom! A dark and sinister aura that erupted into the sky was released from Azura's body that every life form in the continent could feel. At the same time, a soul-shaking roar that promised vengeance and death caused the hearts of its residents to shiver with fear, including the crying ghost. No one would ever forget what happened that bloody day. Roughly 100 years later. A lot had happened in this time, but one word could be used to summarize the entire century that would later on be named as the lifeless century. And that word is war. All across the world, all types of factions waged war against each other for authority over the territories and treasures. The time for banding together with your species and allying with others had passed. There were kings, chiefs, and clan heads everywhere. Now was the time to monopolize territories and increase their strength. The neighboring territory was already occupied by others? No matter, kill them all. And so they charged. But how could the other side just patiently wait for death with smiles on their face? Were they sheep? No. Even the sheep would run you down if you dared to cross them, talk less of the vast majority of predating species. And so they fought back with no hesitation. Both sides would ferociously attack each other with zero regards for life, not letting the other side go unless they ran far away. After all, what they wanted was territory. They weren't specifically targeting lives, just the obstacles to their goals, which just so happened to be lives. Unfortunately, most of the species on the planet had no understanding of morals, and as a result, they had no qualms about reckless murder. In fact, they considered it a glory to kill for their respective factions, most even being rewarded for it. The rewards were mainly things like food and essence-rich treasures. Unlike other worlds, women were not treated like objects to be gifted or used by the leader anyhow he wanted, if the leader was even a male in the first place. Although females were indeed weaker physically, cultivation existed, and so the difference in strength was vanquished. Every other world was naturally a low world once upon a time, and that's when the residents developed customs of objectifying or being overprotective of women. No matter how much a world evolved after that, the instincts of man to woman were already there and they would not change. Only the way in which they achieved their goals changed. For example, it was now impossible to demand a woman to serve you or carry your babies. You would just get a hot slap. You would have to go through the process of courting and sometimes marriage. But things would be different in Eridel's world, which could be considered to have been a mid-world from the beginning. There was true equality, and it was interesting to see how mannerisms in a man-to-woman relationship would progress. Well, there was actually one race that still had the male hegemony mindset, and it was the dragon race, the last race on the planet before Eridel's arrival. Speaking of the dragon race, there were now 2 of them. The Western dragons, aka true dragons, and the Eastern dragons, aka divine dragons. And you would do well not to get them mixed up. This was something that happened around 90 years ago. As previously mentioned, the Snake Clan had been exploring the rest of the continent, sometimes occupying a territory to make a branch clan. Eventually, they found the Western Forest. The leader of the voyage into the Western Forest was naturally Draco. Only he would be dumb enough to run up on a forest that was as big as the one he came from and fail to understand that it could similarly be of the same level in terms of strength. As a result, he got his ass hooped and nearly killed, only living to see another day because Lily came and helped him escape. This was the first clash between the Snake and the Dragon clan and the dawn of a war that would last many, many years. As a matter of fact, Draco did a lot of damage in that encounter by killing a few dragons. He was a law beast after all, so killing any kind of life form was light work to him. But when they grouped up to deal with him, Draco could only flee. A law beast is a beast who had formed his mana from laws. Obviously, the dragons became vigilant and informed their king, ruining the best chance the Snake Clan ever had in making a sneak attack. On the other hand, Draco and Lily made sure to inform Yorma and the rest of the snakes of the dangers of the dragons. Lily's message was focused on preventing the snakes from having any interactions with dragons in the future. In contrast, Draco's message was more on rallying the Snake Clan for revenge, maintaining the dignity of the Snake Clan, blah blah blah. Unfortunately for him, Yorma's verdict was for the Snake Clan to never enter the Western Forest and not antagonize the dragons unless attacked first. At the time, Yorma was way more interested in something she had found in the center of the continent, so she didn't have time for some whatever giant flying lizards. But Draco was too angry. This was the first time he had suffered such a big loss, and it was eating at his soul. He didn't count his encounters with Dodo because the elk had 3 laws and a higher cultivation. It was only right that he lost. But losing to scum like these? He couldn't take it. So he used the techniques that he had learnt from his good old friend Reiko, sneak attacks. He would frequently sneak into the Western Forest and kill any lone dragon that he could find. When the 11th dragon died, it caused a panic that finally caught the king's attention. As the Dragon King, what kind of face would he have left if he allowed his race to suffer such injustice? Did those pesky snakes think that the dragons were prey? Did the snakes think of them as herbivores with no fangs? Nay, they were the apex predators, the dragons. So he rallied all the dragons and attacked. The look on Draco's face when he saw a sky full of thousands of dragons descending on his territory outside the forest was quite comedic. He honestly thought he wouldn't be caught. But the dumb snake failed to realize that whether he was caught or not, the snakes were the only possible enemy. This wasn't like the Eastern Forest where there were 3 other equally powerful forces to guess from. In the Western Forest, the dragons had no enemies. So only the newcomer Snake Clan was the culprit. Whether the fiery snake from earlier was the actual culprit or not, they would hold the whole Snake Clan accountable. That day, the Snake Clan suffered a devastating loss. The whole branch clan owned by Draco was exterminated and he had to flee with Lily to their nearest territory. The Dragon King was quite satisfied with exterminating the entire snake race and didn't mind letting them go. Trying to kill the 2 would be too much work anyways, so he rallied the rest of the dragons and flew back home. A job well done, he had thought. But he certainly wasn't prepared for tens of thousands of high-level snakes led by a ferocious 50-meter-long stage 8 spirit beast to storm his territory. It was obviously Yorma and the rest. This also included the now 3-headed snake Hikulu, who was a stage 4 spirit beast. Although Yorma was busy, she couldn't just let the Snake Clan suffer such a big loss with no profit. So what's a beast overlord to do? She ran up on their territory, of course. She wanted some compensation and she wouldn't leave until she was satisfied. And so a full-blown war took place in the Western Forest. 3 days later the war was over and the losses were tallied. The result of the war was pretty much a tie, both sides suffering heavy casualties but making a massive profit too. But first let's assess the losses on the snake side. 26,000 elite snakes were slaughtered with 5,000 more being crippled. Hikula had one of his heads chopped off, reducing the total number to 2. He wasn't a true Hydra, so there would be no regrowth unless something special happened. Draco had both of his antlers snapped off. Lily had nearly half of her face cut off and Yorma had a couple scales cut off. It was only natural, even though she faced the Dragon King and 3 Supremes by herself, she was a good 4 stages above the Dragon King, who was a stage 4 spirit beast. On top of that, she had a bloodline. If she wanted to, she could use the Dragon King as a toy to casually play with. Only the Supreme Dragons prevented that terrifying fate. Elder Dragons are first-generation dragons. Supreme Dragons are powerful dragons that own one of the 14 peaks on the Dragon Mountain. The 15th peak, or rather the first of the 15, belongs to the Dragon King. Over on the dragon's side there were a total of 2,000 deaths. 7 elders and 3 supremes were killed, with 1 supreme being kidnapped, leaving only 61st generations left. That includes the Dragon King, the 9 destruction dragons and Gaia, the creation dragon. The Dragon King was also heavily injured. As for the gains that the 2 sides made in the war, first with the snakes was the high-quality food that they gained from the dragon carcasses that they dragged back home. As a result, there were a lot of breakthroughs when they settled down. Yorma broke through the 9th stage, which could only be explained by her bloodline's excellent ability to devour essence from organic objects. Hikulu, who was extremely agitated at the loss of a head, broke through to the 5th stage. Lily entered the 3rd stage and Draco finally entered the 1st stage as a spirit beast. But that was not all. Their biggest gain was when Draco evolved. Using the evolutionary blood beast technique on the supreme dragon they had captured, he had managed to obtain the bloodline of a supreme wind dragon. But he did not become an overgrown lizard with wings and a horn. Nay, his foundations were too strong to change that much. However, he did get the best he could out of the bloodline. Sacrificing wings, he managed to obtain 4 legs, extremely hard scales, menacingly sharp claws, a dragon head complete with a full set of fangs, and finally a weird mix of antler and horns. They were still antlers, but they didn't spread out as much as before, and each branch was very profoundly sharp. His amber scales now contained a majestic glow with a small elusive effect that gave the scales a faint lava-like appearance. His lustrous mane now looked like it was fully made from dark red flames, and his golden eyes were now very bright. If he didn't control them, they were fully capable of replacing torchlights, lighting up the path wherever he looked. A terrifying curse for any closet pervert, no doubt. All jokes aside, those effects were a result of Draco's fire laws being encoded into his DNA when he evolved. This evolution that normally would have made him something like a fire law snake is what fused with the supreme wind dragon bloodline to make him what he is now. A long serpentine dragon with sharp antlers instead of horns and a lack of wings. The only thing that set him apart from the eastern dragons back on Earth was the lack of whiskers. When Yorma witnessed these changes of events, she was very pleased but sad at the same time. Since her brother was no longer a snake, sooner or later he wouldn't be able to fit in with the other snakes. Hicula had already faced a slight issue because of his abnormal multiple heads, but because of his strength, no one dared to have any discontent. But Draco was completely different. His head wasn't like that of a snake at all, and he even had legs. The snakes would respect him but never accept him. It could be considered racism. Yorma didn't care too much about such things, but she knew that her feelings alone wouldn't change much. Draco would still be ostracized. Knowing nothing could be done, she decided to have Draco separate from the clan with bountiful gifts. She gave him ownership of their entire territory in the eastern forest, 100 powerful wives from the first generation of snakes, 10,000 elite guards, and the rest of the dragon carcasses so that he could regain his strength quickly. This crazy turn of events definitely caused some discontent in the snakes, but none of them showed it. Yorma was their almighty leader and everything they aspired to be. They would rather die than cause her to be upset. If she wanted to waste their hard-earned resources, then so be it. But the wives and guards that were sent to go with Draco were ecstatic, especially the wives. They were the ones that would enjoy the resources with him after all. On top of that, they were curious about the babies that Draco would grant them. As for the territory in the eastern forest, Yorma gave it up because it was furthest away from the dragons. She wanted Draco to recuperate in safety. She also knew that he had friends there. Naturally, the happiest of them all was Draco, whose reverence in his big sister actually increased. Something that was now very hard to accomplish because of his powerful bloodline and innate arrogance. Never in his life would he forget this gesture. In his heart, Yorma was number one. 90 years full of bloody wars passed and Draco had become a stage 1 seeking beast. An enormous serpentine body with 4 legs and antlers on its head could be seen flying above the clouds of the eastern forest. It was the divine dragon, Draco. And behind Draco was the many children that he had sired over the years. Beautiful divine dragons of different colors and sizes. They all obediently followed their progenitor with visible excitement in their eyes. This was the first time they would be leaving the eastern forest after all. As Draco crossed the border of the eastern forest, he too could no longer contain his excitement. I wonder how big Sis Yorma is doing now? Would she be happy when she sees me? Besides the war between the dragons and the snakes, there were 3 other major wars that occurred on Eridel's world. The first was the war between monsters, beasts and fiends on the southern continent. That was a chaotic event that completely altered the fate of the continent. Why? Well, it's because there are no longer any humans or beasts there anymore. Roughly 50 years ago, Azura had united every monster under his banner with 87 demon kings at the helm, becoming the first emperor in the world, or at least, above the lands. The demon kings were all people like him, people who were blessed by the heavens, obtaining the divine demon physique and wielding the demon king armaments. There were originally 100 of such beings, but the number dwindled over time for numerous reasons. Chrysos was obviously killed by Emperor Azura that dreadful day. The Wraith King escaped and was never seen again, while the other demon kings were killed by either Azura in his path of supremacy, or killed by fiends and beasts that they shouldn't have offended. As for the humans, they could only become the nourishment for other races. Besides the Wraith King who disappeared, there was another demon king who didn't want to bow down to Emperor Azura and had the means to escape. She could be addressed as the Nine-Flame Queen. The Nine-Flame Queen was the leader of the elemental race, a humanoid race that is completely made from a specific element. Other than their human shape, they had no other features. As beings made from an element, every single one of them had a mutated killing essence. Such terrifying beings should have been the rightful rulers of the monsters, but unfortunately for them, a freak existence like Azura exists. The Nine-Flame Queen refused to bow to any other life form and fled the continent entirely. All elementals had the ability to fly, so it wasn't impossible. But the surprise lay with her decision to leave the continent. There was not a single life form with the knowledge of other continents apart from Sierra. Even Titania could only guess but not confirm the existence of other continents. The fear of the unknown prevailed and most people never left their continent even if they could. But the Nine-Flame Queen did, and she successfully left the reach of Emperor Azura. But Azura didn't care in the slightest. He didn't need such an unpredictable subordinate, so he turned a blind eye to it. Azura was more concerned about the rising fights between the monsters, the beasts and the fiends. The Wolf King was the beast who had united all the beasts and rallied them to attack the other two factions. On the other hand, the Crying Ghost kept kidnapping humans to R*PE them and increase the number of fiends. He too didn't let a single monster go if he saw them. The only reason why someone like the Wolf King and Chad aren't emperors is because they don't have any subordinate kings. As tensions rose, the three leaders were eventually unable to endure the existence of each other, and a three-way continental war that lasted 10 years took place. The result was the complete annihilation of the beasts and humans. The only reason the Blood Fiends managed to survive was because of their deep innate cunning and smarts when it came to killing. Azura was very capable of killing the Crying Ghost with a single strike, but when the fiends began to suddenly kill all of his underlings without leaving a trace, he decided to come to a truce. It wasn't worth it to kill the shepherd only for the sheep to start causing chaos everywhere. The beasts were exterminated because of their lack of teamwork outside of those of the same race. On top of that, they didn't have the cunning or smarts of the fiends. They were incapable of causing much trouble to Azura or the other demon kings, and hence, they were massacred. The humans were collateral damage. Azura wanted to stop the fiend's seemingly supernatural ability to reproduce, so he decided to kill off every human to slow it down. Such was the fate of a weak race that barely even knew how to cultivate. They were unable to defend against the hostile intentions of the strong and were consequently destroyed. Besides the immense casualties that the war had caused, a strange experiment that both the monster races and the blood fiends conducted had resulted in a new race. The Devil Race. This occurred when both races decided to start enslaving each other to either find out each other's weak point or to simply use the enemy as sex slaves. The monsters didn't think it would result in a child because no child came from the copulation between monsters and beasts. On the other hand, the blood fiends didn't care either way. It would just be another blood fiend with impure blood. To the blood fiends, blood was obviously regarded very seriously, so they looked down on blood fiends who were born from foreign races. Neither of them were prepared for the appearance of a new race entirely. The devils were beings that took on the characteristics of both races. When they killed a life form that contained blood, the body of the corpse decomposed until all that was left was blood that was quickly absorbed. The more blood they absorbed, the more powerful and perfect their bodies became. They didn't have the ability to wield any kind of essence, but their ridiculously strong bodies were able to make that a mere triviality. They had excellent fighting ability, and by being both cunning and ruthless they were able to become the perfect war machines, but they were very, very evil. The second major war was another three-way war on the western continent. The war that would later on be named as the War of the Legendary Birds was a war that no one would forget. What was initially a fateful war between two arch-enemies was now a three-way war for domination over the continent. This was a war between Chad, the honorable brother, and the Nine-Flame Queen. When the Nine-Flame Queen had escaped the South Continent, she had spent a considerable amount of time at the sea before encountering a small island. This was a cause of joy for her who had spent a month of aimless flying. As a sapient being, being lonely for so long was beginning to feel depressing. Despite the fact that residents of the island were all beasts, she decided to stay here to live with the intention of ruling the entire island. The beasts would never accept her, but she had a trick to overcome that. After a full day of scouting, she had identified the most talented beast on the island, and it was a peacock with lava affinity. The beast had black feathers with red lava-like streaks running along its body and beautiful tail train. Its red blazing eyes were also a sight to behold. It was most probably a beast that was next to the volcano in the center of the island when the magical outburst occurred, achieving an evolution into the lava peacock that it was now. Although it wasn't perfect for the 9 Flame Queen's plans, it would do. Swooping down from the air, she headed straight for the peacock as if she was going to dive bomb it. The peacock had looked up in astonishment, but it was too late. It did not even have the time to feel fear before the 9 Flame Queen and the 9 slightly dark red fireballs that had been constantly surrounding her since her birth collided with the peacock. But mysteriously, there was no explosion or even any sound. In fact, the 9 Flame Queen along with 9 fireballs that were clearly her Demon King armament had actually disappeared into the peacock. Shortly after, the peacock began to rapidly shake all over the place as if it was having a seizure. Dark red flames also erupted from all of its orifices, creating a terrifying scene. It was as if the peacock was being possessed. And indeed it was. This was one of the skills that the 9 Flame Queen's Demon King armament came with. It was a skill that allowed the wielder, 9 Flame Queen, to possess any living being she wanted to so long as the target met the requirements. It was unnecessary to do such a thing back in the South Continent, and even if there was someone worth possessing like Emperor Azura, such people could easily resist the technique and she could possibly die as a consequence. A rank 6 magic beast peacock that was around 80 years old like this was extremely easy to possess. It's not that the talent of the beast was low, as a matter of fact it could be considered profoundly talented even compared to the rest of the world, but in a backwater environment like this with barely any resources, its growth was heavily stunted. The fact that it even reached rank 6 of the magic beast stage was already impressive. Soon, the peacock began to self-destruct before being reformed with a more perfect body, and in all that time, the 9 Flame Queen watched with confusion. She had never used this skill before and had no idea of what possession should be like, but she was sure something was wrong. She could tell that her body was assimilating with the peacock, twisting its nature and becoming something completely different. If that happened, how was she supposed to leave the beast when she was done with it? But soon, the answer came to her. As the body of the peacock finished changing and the surrounding dark red flames that blocked prying eyes dispersed, a flabbergasting sight was revealed. The peacock's feathers had changed color, becoming a startling crimson color that caught the eyes whilst also being intimidating. The same lava-like streaks running down its body were still there, but this time, they were glowing with a hot red color as if they contained untold firepower. The peacock's body structure had also changed, its head, torso and wings becoming bigger. In fact, its bodily structure was somewhat similar to Chad the Phoenix. But different to Chad, this new entity that could no longer be called a peacock had a majestic tuft of feathers on its head that was split into 2 portions on each side of its head. On top of that, the bird's tail train had actually split into 9 tails, each tail ending off in a familiar dark red fireball. And its vermilion red eyes now look extremely daunting as they glowed with no pupil in sight. The bird looked like an absolute weapon of mass carnage with divine beauty, giving off extremely dense killing intent vibes that caused the residents of the entire island to freeze in fear. This was the new 9 Flame Queen. She was sure of it now. She had lost the ability to possess any other life form, even leaving this body was now impossible. This was the new her. There was no longer 9 Flame Queen of the elementals. Now she was 9 Flame Queen, the bird. With the superior intelligence that she gained from the divine demon physique, she now understood that her possession skill was somewhat of a sham. The skill did not allow her to possess other life forms as she liked. No, it was a life-saving skill that she was supposed to use to assimilate with another life form if her life was ever in peril. Half an hour ago, when she was still assimilating, such a thought would have terrified her. It meant that she would forever have to live with a trashy beast body and never leave. Such a future was as good as being crippled. Not because the beast's was actually trash, but because its foundations were already wrecked. Being a 77-year-old stage 6 magic beast was atrocious, and now it was way past the golden age of cultivation. Cultivation would now be very arduous. This wasn't the same for a 77-year-old stage 2 elite monster because their lifespan was incredibly long. If they had human forms, their 77-year-old body wouldn't look much different from a 16-year-old mortal human. But now, things were very different. Not only was her new body's age reset completely, she had kept the same cultivation as before. In fact, she had even leveled up once, becoming a stage 3 elite monster. That was the result of absorbing all the essence of a stage 6 magic beast. To an elite monster it wasn't much, but it helped push her over the edge. But that wasn't it. She could feel the power within her that far surpassed what a Stage 3 elite monster cultivation base should give her. And she wasn't quite fully monster anymore. The mutated killing essence in her body felt somehow different. She could feel the new affinity with lava, but that wasn't it. It was as if the entire nature of its essence had changed. It was no longer geared towards the sole intent of killing. It was now other. The Nine-Flame Queen released the essence out of her body just to test it out. She wanted to know what changed. SSSSSSHH. Unexpectedly, unlike the usual dark red light, dark red flames erupted out of her body. It must be known that even if someone had mutated killing essence, its appearance would not be any different from regular killing essence, only its effect would change. Divine demon physiques were the only thing that could change its appearance, but even then, all that changed was its color. But the Nine-Flame Queen's so-called killing scene was absolutely abnormal. And as if it were sentient, it emitted a blood-curdling killing intent that seemed to want all life to burn. Even more peculiar was the bestial majesty that was being radiated. That was because this was the kind of aura only seen on beast kings. What kind of creature did the Nine-Flame Queen become? She didn't know, but she didn't care. She was very powerful right now and she quite liked that. However, she could now notice the gazes of fear trained on her body. Joining into this habitat was now impossible. They would never accept her. She could rule them with fear, but now, her potential was limitless and she had higher ambitions. This little island wasn't enough to satisfy her. But their lives weren't something she was ready to waste. Despite her new form, she was still a monster. Or at least half. The Nine-Flame Queen spent the next 3 months flying above the seas once again. In this time she had passed many islands, but none of them entered her eyes. She didn't consider any of them worthy and she continued to fly. In her new body, the rate at which she flew was a good 20x faster than before, so it wasn't a wonder why she had passed so many islands in this time. But what was beginning to get on the Nine-Flame Queen's nerves was the growing disappointment. She had been expecting to find a landmass on the same level of her homeland, but up till now, there was nothing in comparison. But she refused to settle for anything less. So another week of constant flying passed. Even though her new body retained its ability of not needing food, she still needed energy. Monsters regularly slept to recover their energy, even the higher level ones still slept at least once a week. But the last time the Nine-Flame Queen had seen an island was 3 weeks ago, meaning that was also the last time she had a good sleep. And it was beginning to take its toll on her. Unlike the area around the South Continent, there were no rocky peaks poking above the sea for her to rest on. Her energy was running dangerously low, and if she didn't change that fact soon, it would be over for her. How humiliating would it be for a life form of her level to die from overexerting herself? Ludicrous. Just as the Nine-Flame Queen was beginning to panic, a grand stretch of land began to peek over the horizon. At first, the Queen was skeptical, but soon she could see what was similar to the seabed of the South Continent and she was ecstatic. Using the rest of her energy, she headed straight for land. A few months had passed when the two hegemons Chad and Honorable Brother had realized something was seriously wrong. A lot had changed since the so-called Honorable Brother's betrayal. Using the grace period, which was Chad's weakened status, he had managed to voraciously consume all kinds of resources to power level himself. Since he had already broken through all the bottlenecks to reach the spirit beast realm, he didn't need to repeat the process, so it was extremely smooth sailing. In this time frame, 3 weeks, not only did he forcefully subjugate more and more of Chad's forces in the north, but he had also forcefully impregnated all sorts of compatible bird beasts to rear his children. Not one of these females obtained a lick of energy from him, so they all died without fail when the eggs were laid. And like this, a clan of ice phoenixes began to brew. When Chad had fully recovered, the whole north had been taken. At this point, the Honorable Brother had become a Stage 1 spirit beast and was able to barely fend off the furious phoenix, who was still a Stage 9 magic beast when he had come for his life. But he wasn't able to prevent Chad from catching sight of all the phoenix eggs that were near the point of hatching already. This infuriated Chad when he understood what had been going on during the time he was bedridden. But it wasn't the fact that he was taking innocent lives that angered him. It was the fact that the Honorable Brother dared to have children after eating his own. Not even the fact that the Honorable Brother had somehow become a phoenix like himself on top of wielding strangely ice-cold flames had angered him that much. He would never let himself suffer such an injustice. But Chad could not bring himself to destroy the phoenix eggs that looked so much like his own but with different colors and patterns. So he returned to his territory. Unfortunately for the residents of his territory, they weren't prepared for their righteous leader to start using the same heinous tricks that the honorable brother had used to create children. Chad had actually begun to forcefully impregnate a multitude of suitable bird beasts to rear phoenix eggs the same way the honorable brother did. A few decades later the continent had been divided in two by the constant fighting between two legendary phoenix clans, the Ice Phoenix clan and the Pure Phoenix clan. The northern side was obviously inhabited by the honorable brother and his clan, which leaves Chad in the south. On each side you can see beautiful majestic phoenixes that were giving orders to the other species in their respective territories. For a while, they had discovered that their subordinates, including a few phoenixes, had been disappearing unnaturally. Such a reality was incomprehensible to the two forces, but nothing could be done, so they decided to put it in the back of their mind. Somewhat of a mistake. It was when a colossal bird beast that was even more domineering than both Chad and the honorable brother appeared with soul-shaking killing intent that the two clan leaders knew they were in serious trouble. The Nine-Flame Queen appeared in the southern region with blazing might, her killing intent striking primordial fear into the hearts of all life forms and her beauty tantalizing the two hegemons. The honorable brother even breached into the southern region just so that he could get a closer look. Like a moth to a flame. Both clan leaders were equal parts enamored and fearful of the newcomer, but nothing other than righteous rage appeared on their faces. It was like they were looking at the murderer of their children. They indeed knew the experience. The honorable brother was obviously good at hiding his feelings, and on the other hand, Chad was Chad. Were they also squinting their eyes? Light-skin face? Noticing that the situation was dire and a perfect opportunity had been presented to him, the honorable brother was the first to flee back to his territory in the north. Unfortunately, with Chad already being in his territory, he wouldn't have that opportunity. Unless he wanted to follow the honorable brother, a foolish idea, he would have to somehow fend off this newcomer by himself. But he knew the odds of winning were heavily against him. Even though he was a law beast, he could still feel the hopeless difference in strength, and he couldn't comprehend why. The Nine-Flame Queen opened her magnificent beak as a dark red fireball formed inside. Just as Chad was thinking he was done for, a chorus of melodious but mighty phoenix cries swam through the sky with indomitable spirit. Beautiful amber-colored phoenixes broke through the tall tree tops and soared into the sky with fury stained on their faces as they glared at the Nine-Flame Queen. Seeing his family ready to die for him, the turbulent emotions in Chad's heart slowly dissipated. How could he cower in front of family? As the clan leader, he wouldn't leave until death accepted his courtship. The glare he then gave to the Nine-Flame Queen, even having a hint of provocation. The Nine-Flame Queen paused. She knew things could become very annoying and it grated on her nerves. She knew she could take the leader of the phoenixes by herself with ease, but with the hundreds of phoenixes there to help him, it was almost certain that she would suffer major damage. On top of that, a nagging feeling of jealousy was seeping into her heart. Seeing the tight relationship between the phoenix race and their ancestor was bringing up memories of herself with the elementals. But even the elementals weren't as closely knitted with her compared to the sight before her eyes. Monsters weren't built to be all that cozy with each other after all. Their main priority was killing. Tribal systems just helped in efficiency, nothing more, nothing less. Just as Chad was about to begin the battle of certain death, the Nine-Flame Queen made a few motions towards him. The beast language. The beasts all around the world had already formed their own signals and signs to achieve cross-species communication. How could the beasts in the West Continent be lacking? The main reason the Nine-Flame Queen had been laying low ever since she had arrived on this continent before now was because she was learning these very signs. When Chad deciphered the messages performed by the Nine-Flame Queen, he was shocked. The Nine-Flame Queen wanted to split the territory of the West Continent once again. Chad was shocked, but he quickly made the motion for agree. He couldn't waste this opportunity. 40 years later, year 90. The West Continent was in the middle of a dreadful war that had blood spill all over the continent like a liquid plague. Where blood was shed, more blood was shed. Its area of influence would always increase and nobody was safe. Why was there another war despite the equilibrium that should have been maintained between the now three legendary races? Well, this was the result of the honorable brother finally accomplishing his nearly a century-long goal. Taking his former leader's wives. Obviously this didn't go well with Chad. With blinding fury, Chad made a path of corpses towards the north with only the idea of slaughter on his mind. At this moment in time, the West Continent had been split in 3 sections. It was the Honorable Brother in the north aka, Frozen Territory. Chad in the southeast aka, Pure Society, and the Nine-Flame Queen in the southwest aka, Purgatory Forest. Chad had already become a seeking beast, enabling him to summon forth the bare minimum of the fire laws, but just that was enough to strike fear in the heart of the Nine-Flame Queen, who was stage 9 elite monster, not to mention that she was several times stronger than any other monster of the same level. It should also be mentioned that a regular monster was stronger than a regular beast of the same level. The point is, his newfound strength on top of the presence of the Honorable Brother enabled them to keep the Nine-Flame Queen in check despite her fully developed clan of her own. However, this changed when the the Despicable Brother had successfully kidnapped the two wives of the pure Phoenix King, causing Chad to throw all caution to the wind in his path of vengeance. Naturally, the Nine-Flame Queen wasn't going to let this wonderful opportunity waste. Although she didn't need to kill like before to become stronger, she had found out long ago that she could absorb essence from eating essence-rich resources after she became the legendary bird she is today. Killing was still very resourceful, and she could use this war to break through to the greater demon realm. And like this, there was no location on the continent that Carnage's revolting legs didn't reach. 2 years later, year 92, one of Chad's claws was wrapped tightly around the Despicable Brother's neck, the rage in his eyes even more ferocious and malevolent than the hate that had consumed him 2 years ago. That was because a few minutes ago, he had finally located the Despicable Brother who had disappeared a year ago along with his two wives. But they were no longer the wives he knew. They were still, calm and unreactive to his presence. Silent, dull and lifeless. They were dead. And right between their legs was a phoenix egg that thrummed with life. That was the moment the phoenix who had specialized in the laws of fire and life had nearly become an abomination. Luckily, the law body that he gained when he evolved at the Spirit Beast breakthrough allowed those two laws to encode itself in his DNA. Such a powerful body was obviously resistant to all forms of ailments including abomination conversion, but even then it was a close call. Boom! When Chad came to, the literal flames of rage that exploded outside of him almost consumed everything. The Despicable Brother who was only a few inches away from him with his icy flame-wielding claws stretching forth was blasted away, almost dead in a single blow. His plan had failed and he was finished. He knew it. The Despicable Brother had planned for this very moment since he laid his sight on Chad's two wives many decades ago. He knew that there was no other scenario that allowed him to kill his previous leader unless he obtained a supernatural power. Becoming an ice phoenix wasn't enough. So he plotted and plotted, revised, refined and polished his schemes until he got to this point. But even that was not enough. At this point, he was simply tired. He was done contending with monstrous existences. He was done with having to withstand the grating envy that would never leave him alone. Just let him die. The Despicable Brother slumped even further down the cave wall. The very same cave that he had hid in when he evolved, becoming the Ice Phoenix. The very same cave that was in Chad's territory even now. The Despicable Brother watched as Chad grabbed the bodies of his two dead wives and the only remaining egg that wasn't destroyed in his anger before flying off into the distance. The Despicable Brother was a little confused. Killing him wouldn't take much effort, so why clear out the area? He didn't have illusions that Chad was sparing him. He knew that his previous leader would never let him go. And indeed, Chad returned a few minutes later only to grab the unresisting Despicable Brother by the neck and fly off once more. Now the Despicable Brother was beginning to panic. He didn't like things that he couldn't predict. It was rare and oftentimes very deadly. Even if he had already accepted death, he was still afraid. They passed many sceneries before delving deep underground and arriving at an underground cavern. Chad carried the limp Despicable Brother to the floor of the cave before abruptly biting into his chest with his beak, reaching deep and tearing the beast core right out of his body. This was a procedure that directly crippled the prone recipient, causing them to lose all their cultivation for the rest of their lives, unable to make a comeback ever again. This normally happened to beasts before they were banished from their territory, but now it was happening to the Despicable Brother and he was not happy. Before he could even process thoughts, chains made from golden flames appeared and wrapped around his neck and limbs, including his wings, before plunging into the ground. Sheer. The flames burned him so viciously that he thought his very sense of self, soul, would be erased, causing him to shriek out in agony. But then the effect of the flames changed. They started to heal all the damage around his body in a purposefully crude manner, causing the healing process to also hurt. Just when he was about to gather his thoughts, The destructive element of the phoenix flames returned with soul-stirring force that caused him to wheeze, already unable to summon the energy to scream. The last thing he saw before he blacked out was the pair of sinister eyes that promised nothing but suffering. And he was very, very terrified. This brings us to the last and final major war. No, that was not right, nobody would call it a war. It was devastation at its finest. A calamity that was so abominable that it wiped away almost all life in the North Continent. And it was the result of a single being. The abomination of the North. Year 125. The land of all monsters could be considered the South Continent. But that's not to say that they were restricted to that area alone. In every other main continent, Central, West, East and North, there were a few monsters that could be found if you were unlucky. But at this point in time, most if not all were dead. With their crazy murderous mentalities that caused them to rarely ever shy away from a fight, it left little to wonder on why their already abysmal numbers began to dwindle. But they were not all dead. Oh no, but I bet you the whole North Continent would wish they were. Unfortunately, they no longer have the qualifications to wish for anything. The beginning of the North's End began with a slime. A monster slime. The LVL-1 jelly monsters you fight when you first play an RPG game. Yes, that slime. Slimes were a common monster with very little power, their only saving grace was their incredible ability to reproduce. Taking all this into consideration, nobody could have predicted a slime would be the doom of their lives. Nobody would have thought that a lowly slime would be the first to find a Domicus treasure. A Domicus treasure. An inimitable treasure created by Eridel himself for the residents of his world. But do not compare them to just any odd treasure that Eridel had made, because not even the Demon King armament could be considered a Domicus treasure. Each of the Domicus treasures were so powerful that anyone lucky enough to wield one was destined for supremacy. But that was just one of the things that made the lowly slime the continental calamity that it was now. When the blue slime had ventured into an underground desert cave, it had found two orbs held upon pedestals. One was green and the other was a dark gray. The green orb pulsed with a ridiculous amount of the laws of life, whilst the dark gray orb pulsed with laws of death of the same quantity. Each of them were so potent that they could cause anyone who wielded one to obtain boundless power of its respective element. Wielding the green orb, you and your allies were most likely to never die. All injuries, ailments, deformities and irregularities would become a nonentity. Wielding the dark gray orb, you were most likely to be one of the most feared damage dealers in the world, with none of your enemies being able to escape. Indeed, both of these treasures were Domicus treasures. Two of them in one spot. But that's not to say it was possible for one person to own them both. How could such conflictive elements be contained in one body? When someone grabbed an orb, it would immediately bind with the person and the other orb would forever be out of that person's reach. It was absolutely impossible. Or it should have been. But when the slime took advantage of his special constitution to stretch out and grab both at the same time, a shocking situation occurred. Both orbs initiated the bind with their host, causing their respective essences to flood the inside of the slime's body. Accordingly, they began to react violently when they made contact with each other. Meanwhile, the slime's body began to convulse as pain racked its very soul. But even then, untold chaotic power began to rise in its body and its killing essence changed in nature. Beginner Monster Stage 4. Beginner Monster Stage 5. Beginner Monster Stage 6. Beginner Monster Stage 9. As a slime, let's not talk about the fact that it's a 125-year-old Realm 1 being, but the fact that it had managed to raise itself to Stage 3 was quite the feat. Most slimes don't even have the power to kill anyone, consequently never rising in strength. But in a heartbeat, the slime's cultivation rose to the brink of its realm and it didn't show any signs of slowing down. Intermediate Monster Stage 1. And here's where things went wrong. Just like beasts, monsters have the chance of evolving when they break through to the next realm. And just like any other life form going through such a delicate transformation, there is a chance of becoming an abomination. The convulsions in the slime's body increased as it began to balloon in size. A mucus-like substance was constantly leaking out of the body as if it was melting, and when they made contact with the ground, it began to dissolve. Before now, the two orbs had still been fighting for dominance inside the slime's body. But when its abomination transformation began, they too began to dissolve as they assimilated with the host. This was something that never should have happened, but abominations were just that strange. They were completely unpredictable, and while it was easy to predict what could initiate an abomination transformation, what happened after that was impossible to guess. Even Eridel with his numerous calculations couldn't predict what made abominations the fuck-ups that they were. As a result, Eridel was completely blindsided to the situation. As the assimilation progressed, the essences began to corrupt each other, becoming something else entirely. It wasn't an unknown essence in other worlds, but if they found it anywhere near them they would run with no hesitation. As the new essence assimilated with the slime's killing essence, the changes in the slime's body increased. First, its cultivation skyrocketed even faster than before, already at the elite monster realm and still climbing. Second, was the change in color the slime was experiencing as its whole body turned a deathly gray, but not quite as dark as the essence of death. And third was the grotesque change in form it was undergoing. Its body had lost its transparency and its smooth composition had twisted into an unrecognizable state that never stayed the same. To be honest, it looked like a 50-meter tall piece of gray-colored shit that didn't stop twisting and wiggling. It was very, very ugly. But it was also very, very powerful.